Sometimes life strips away everything we thought we needed, only to show us what we've been searching for all along. When loneliness becomes your only companion, hope feels like a stranger you've forgotten how to recognize. Thaddeus Crowe, a mountain man in his 60s, lives alone in the Rocky Mountain wilderness, carrying wounds that never quite healed. Martha Quinn, a 64-year-old widow, lost her home to fire and now sleeps in a church stable with nothing but her pride. When Thad finds her there, he speaks the plainest truth he knows. I need a wife, and you need a home. It's not romance, it's survival. But sometimes the most practical arrangements bloom into something beautiful. Can two broken hearts find healing in the simple act of choosing each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Rocky Mountain peaks like memories that refused to fade, and Thaddeus Crowe stood on his cabin porch watching the sun paint the world in shades of amber and gold. At 62, his body still carried the lean strength of a man accustomed to hard living, though silver now threaded through his dark hair and lines mapped the corners of his weathered face. In his hand, he gripped a walking stick carved from mountain oak, its surface etched with symbols that most folks wouldn't recognize. Military unit markings from a war that ended nearly 2 decades ago, but still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. The cabin behind him stood solid and uncompromising against the mountain slope. Built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed below. Every board, every chink of mortar between the logs, spoke of a man who'd learned to depend on no one but himself. The porch wrapped around 3 sides of the structure, providing shelter from mountain storms and a place to sit in the evenings when the solitude pressed too close. Inside, the rooms were spare but functional, a main area that served as kitchen, dining and sitting room, a bedroom barely large enough for his narrow bed, and a storage room where he kept his traps, tools, and the few possessions he'd carried into these mountains 15 years ago. Thad had chosen this life deliberately, the way a wounded animal chooses a den far from the pack. The war, that grinding, senseless conflict that had swallowed so many good men, had left him with wounds that ran deeper than the scar along his left shoulder where Confederate steel had found its mark. The worst damage was invisible, written in the way he startled at sudden sounds, the way he positioned himself with his back to walls, the way he sometimes woke, gasping from dreams, filled with the screams of dying boys who'd followed him into battle and never came home. He'd tried returning to civilization after Appomattox, had even married a sweet girl named Catherine, who'd waited for him through 4 years of war. But the man who came back wasn't the same one who'd marched away, and Catherine had slowly realized she was living with a stranger who jumped at shadows and talked to ghosts only he could see. The divorce had been quiet, civilized even, but it had confirmed what Thad already knew. He was no longer fit for the company of decent people, so he'd taken his mustering-out pay, bought supplies, and headed west until he found these mountains that reminded him of the hills back home in Tennessee, but empty of the memories that haunted familiar ground. Here, among the pine and aspen, he'd built a life of solitary purpose. He trapped beaver and fox, hunted deer and elk, traded pelts in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls when his stores ran low. It was a hard life, but an honest one, and it asked nothing of him except the strength of his back and the skill of his hands. The people of Cedar Falls had grown accustomed to his monthly visits over the years. They knew him as a man of few words who paid his debts, kept his bargains, and never caused trouble. The storekeeper, Samuel Morrison, had long since stopped trying to draw him into conversation beyond the necessities of trade. The townspeople respected his privacy the way mountain folk respected a wolf's territory, from a safe distance, with wary acknowledgement of something wild that was best left undisturbed. But this morning, as Thad prepared for his October trading trip, something felt different in the crisp mountain air. Perhaps It was the way the aspens had turned a more brilliant gold than usual, or the fact that the first snow would come early this year if the signs were true. Perhaps it was simply the weight of another winter approaching, another season of isolation stretching ahead like an unmarked trail, disappearing into white silence. He loaded his pack mule, Gideon, with the pelts he'd accumulated since his last trip, prime beaver and fox that would fetch good prices from Morrison's store. The animal was as steady and taciturn as his master, a grey creature with intelligent eyes who'd been Thad's only companion for the better part of 5 years. Together, they knew the mountain trails like a hymn learned in childhood, every switchback and creek crossing memorized through countless journeys. The trail to Cedar Falls wound down through stands of pine and aspen, past the high meadow where he'd seen elk grazing in the early morning light, down to where the creek ran white and noisy over granite boulders. It was a 2-hour ride on a good day, longer when snow made the path treacherous, but Thad had made this journey in all seasons and all weather. The mountains had taught him patience, had schooled him in the virtue of moving at nature's pace rather than fighting against forces larger than himself. As he rode, his mind wandered to practical concerns, what supplies he'd need for the coming winter, whether Morrison had received the new steel traps he'd ordered, if the old Norwegian who lived up Copper Creek had made it through the summer, or if Thad would find his cabin empty come spring. These were the thoughts that occupied a man living close to the bone of existence, where a miscalculation about firewood or a failure to repair a roof leak could mean the difference between comfort and misery through the long mountain winter. Cedar Falls sat in a valley where 3 creeks converged, a collection of weathered buildings that had grown organically around the needs of miners, loggers, and the scattered homesteaders who'd claimed parcels of valley land. The town boasted a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the white-painted church that served as the community's moral anchor. Pastor William Hartwell, a scholarly man who'd come west after losing his congregation in Ohio to theological disputes, ministered to a flock that was sometimes more familiar with the bottom of a whiskey bottle than the pages of Scripture. But he persevered with the patient determination of a man who believed salvation could find even the most lost souls. It was Pastor Hartwell who'd first mentioned Martha Quinn to Thad, though not by name and not with any intention of matchmaking. The conversation had been brief, conducted while Thad waited for Morrison to tally his pelts, and had concerned the church's new resident, a woman who'd lost her home to fire and was temporarily sleeping in the stable behind the sanctuary. Proud as Lucifer, Pastor Hartwell had said, shaking his greyed head. Won't accept charity, insists on working for her keep by cleaning the church and mending vestments. I've offered her the use of the parsonage spare room, but she says the stable suits her fine until she can make other arrangements. The pastor's voice had carried the particular frustration of a man accustomed to helping others who encountered someone too stubborn to be helped. At the time, Thad had filed the information away without much interest. The troubles of townspeople rarely touched his mountain solitude, and he'd learned long ago that good intentions often created more problems than they solved. But something about the phrase, proud as Lucifer, had stuck with him during the ride back to his cabin. Perhaps because he recognized in it an echo of his own stubborn independence. Now, descending into Cedar Falls on this crisp October morning, Thad found himself wondering about the woman in the stable. Not from any romantic inclination, such thoughts had been buried with his failed marriage and the realization that his damaged spirit was better suited to solitude, but from the practical concern of one survivor recognizing another's predicament. Winter was coming, and the mountains showed no mercy to the unprepared, whether they lived in a well-built cabin or a church stable. The town was beginning to stir as he rode down Main Street, smoke rising from chimneys and the sound of axes splitting kindling echoing from behind the buildings. Morrison's store wouldn't open for another hour, which gave Thad time for his usual routine, checking on Gideon at the livery stable, walking the streets to stretch legs cramped from the mountain ride. and observing the small dramas of community life that unfolded in a settlement where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was during this morning walk that he first saw her, though he didn't immediately understand the significance of the moment. She was emerging from the church stable carrying a wooden bucket, her movements deliberate and economical in the way of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the tasks that mattered. Even from a distance, he could see the careful attention she paid to her appearance. Hair pinned back neatly, despite the humble circumstances. Dress clean and pressed, though clearly worn. Posture straight, despite whatever burdens she carried. Martha Quinn was 64 years old, though good bones and careful living made her appear younger in the kind light of early morning. She'd been born Martha Caldwell on a farm outside Springfield, Illinois, the daughter of a man who believed education was as important for daughters as sons. Her father had scraped together the money to send her to the normal school in Springfield, where she'd trained as a teacher and met James Quinn, a young man studying to become a clerk in the state capital. Their marriage had been built on shared dreams of respectability and modest prosperity. James had eventually established a small accounting practice, and Martha had taught school until the children came. 2 sons and a daughter who'd grown to adulthood and scattered to distant cities where opportunity beckoned. For 37 years, their life had followed the predictable patterns of middle-class respectability: church on Sundays, community social events, careful saving for their eventual retirement. The first crack in their foundation had appeared 5 years before James's death, when Martha discovered that her husband's accounting practice had become entangled with some unsavory characters who convinced him to invest their savings in a mining speculation that existed only on paper. James had been horrified by his naivety, but the damage was done. Their nest egg had vanished, and worse, they owed money to men who collected debts with methods that didn't involve courtrooms. James had worked frantically to repay what they owed, taking on additional clients and working long hours that probably contributed to the heart attack that killed him 2 years later. Martha had managed to keep their small house by taking in sewing and teaching piano lessons to local children, but the creditors had waited like vultures for James's death to circle back and demand payment of debts she hadn't known existed. The fire that consumed her house 6 months ago had been the final blow, destroying not only her shelter, but the few valuables she might have sold to satisfy the debt collectors. The insurance had covered barely half of what she owed the bank, leaving her with nothing but the clothes she'd been wearing, and a small carpet bag containing her few remaining possessions, including a charred Bible that had somehow survived the flames and a worn wedding ring that reminded her of happier times. Pride had brought her to Cedar Falls, where she'd hoped to find work as a schoolteacher in a community desperate enough for education to overlook her lack of references. But the town already had a schoolmaster, a young man fresh from teachers' college who commanded respect through his youth and credentials rather than experience and wisdom. Pastor Hartwell had offered her sanctuary in the church stable, and she'd accepted with the understanding that it was temporary, just until she could figure out her next step. The stable was clean and dry, though cold, and Martha had made it as comfortable as possible with a bed of straw covered by quilts she'd sewn herself years ago. She'd established routines that preserved her dignity, rising early to tend to her needs before the town awakened, cleaning the church in exchange for her lodging, spending her afternoons walking the hills around Cedar Falls where she could think without the weight of curious eyes following her movements. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd taught school for 15 years, who'd raised 3 children and buried a husband, who'd learned that survival sometimes required accepting help while maintaining the self-respect that made such help bearable. The people of Cedar Falls had quickly learned to address her as Mrs. Quinn rather than Martha, a formality that acknowledged her status as a widow deserving of respect rather than pity. This morning, as she carried water from the well to wash her few dishes, Martha was acutely aware of the approaching winter and the dwindling options it represented. She'd saved a small amount of money from the sewing work she'd managed to find, but not enough to secure proper lodging through the cold months ahead. Pastor Hartwell had hinted that she might be welcome to stay in the church through the winter, but Martha knew that charity, however kindly offered, could become a burden to both giver and receiver if extended too long. She'd been considering writing to her eldest son in California, though the thought rankled. Richard had made it clear during his father's funeral that he considered his parents' financial difficulties to be the result of poor judgment rather than bad luck, and his wife had never warmed to Martha's plain-spoken ways. Still, family obligations might compel them to offer her a place, even if it came with the price of feeling like an unwanted dependent in her son's household. As she worked, Martha was aware of the mountain man who'd ridden into town and was now walking the streets in his deliberate way. She'd heard talk of Thaddeus Crowe during her months in Cedar Falls, how he lived alone in the high country, how he came to town only for supplies, how he minded his own business and expected others to do the same. The stories painted him as something between a hermit and a wild man, though the reality seemed more prosaic, simply a man who'd chosen solitude over society for reasons known only to himself. Their paths crossed that morning near the church steps, where Martha was shaking out the rug she'd been cleaning. Thad had been walking past when a gust of wind caught one of the rugs and sent it tumbling toward the street. Without thinking, he stepped forward and caught it, holding the woven rectangle between them while dust motes danced in the morning sunlight. "Thank you," Martha said, accepting the rug with hands that showed the calluses of honest work. "The wind up here takes some getting used to." Thad nodded, studying her face with the careful attention of a man accustomed to reading sign and weather. What he saw was a woman who'd known both comfort and hardship, whose eyes held the particular weariness that came from fighting a losing battle against circumstances beyond her control. But there was steel there too, the kind of quiet strength that bent without breaking. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. It was his usual greeting to the respectable women of Cedar Falls, polite but distant. Yet something about Martha Quinn's steady gaze and the way she carried herself, despite her obvious circumstances, made him linger a moment longer than usual. "You're Mr. Crowe," she said. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. "Pastor Hartwell mentioned you might be coming to town soon." "Yes, ma'am." "Trading day." He gestured toward Morrison's store, though his eyes remained on her face. "Pastor says you're staying at the church." Temporarily, Martha's chin lifted slightly, a gesture that managed to convey both acknowledgement of her situation and determination not to be pitied for it. "Until I can make other arrangements." Thad understood the language of pride. It was written in his own careful distance from the townspeople. His insistence on paying cash for everything he needed. His refusal to accept help even when mountain winters tested his endurance to its limits. He recognized in Martha Quinn a kindred spirit, someone who understood that accepting charity often came at the cost of self-respect. "Winter comes early in these mountains," he said, the closest he could come to expressing concern without offering unwanted advice. "So I've been told." Martha's voice carried no complaint, simply acknowledgement of another challenge to be faced. "I'm sure something will work out." They parted then, Thad continuing his walk toward Morrison's store and Martha returning to her cleaning. But something had shifted in that brief exchange, a recognition passing between two people who'd learned to navigate the world alone and understood the particular difficulties that solitude could bring. Neither would have described it as attraction. They were both too practical and too wounded for such romantic notions, but both carried away a sense of having encountered someone who understood the weight of carrying on when the easy answers had all been. Exhausted, the rest of Thad's morning followed its usual pattern, trading his pelts for supplies, purchasing the few luxuries he allowed himself, coffee, sugar, tobacco for his pipe, discussing weather prospects with Morrison and the other early customers. But underneath the familiar routine, his mind kept returning to the woman at the church, to the quiet dignity with which she faced circumstances that would have broken many people. as he loaded his purchases onto Gideon's pack frame. Thad found himself thinking about the approaching winter and the harsh realities it would bring to anyone without proper shelter. The church stable might suffice for autumn weather, but when the snow came in earnest and temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time, good intentions and quilts wouldn't be enough to keep a person alive. He was a man of few words and practical solutions, someone who'd learned to see problems clearly and address them without sentimentality. And as he prepared to leave Cedar Falls for his mountain cabin, Thaddeus Crowe was beginning to see the outline of a solution that might serve two people who'd forgotten what it meant to have someone to depend on. 3 days later, Thad returned to Cedar Falls with a decision that had crystallized during the long hours of solitude in his mountain cabin. The idea had come to him while splitting wood for the winter. A practical solution to two practical problems, as clear and unadorned as mountain air. He needed someone to help him through what promised to be a harsh winter, someone to tend the cabin when he was checking trap lines, someone to talk to during the long evenings when silence pressed too close. And Martha Quinn needed shelter, security, and a place where her skills and dignity could flourish rather than merely survive. The ride down from his cabin had given him time to refine his thoughts, to strip away any romantic notions and focus on the stark arithmetic of mutual need. He wasn't offering marriage in the traditional sense. He'd tried that once and failed spectacularly. What he was considering was more like a business partnership, a practical arrangement between two adults who understood that survival sometimes required unconventional solutions. Pastor Hartwell was in his study when Thad knocked on the parsonage door, the morning light slanting through windows that overlooked the small cemetery where Cedar Falls buried its dead. The pastor was a scholarly man in his 50s, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the patient demeanor of someone who'd learned to listen more than he spoke. He looked up from his sermon notes with surprise. Thaddeus Crowe rarely sought conversation, much less initiated social calls. "Mr. Crowe," Pastor Hartwell said, rising from his desk and gesturing to a chair. "This is unexpected. Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee?" Thad remained standing, hat in his hands, the careful formality of a man unaccustomed to indoor conversations. "Pastor, I wanted to ask about Mrs. Quinn, how she's faring." "Ah," Pastor Hartwell's expression grew thoughtful. "She's a remarkable woman, truly. Proud, as I mentioned before, but in the best sense of the word. She's been a blessing to our little church. Everything is cleaner and more organized than it's been in years. But winter," he shook his head. "I'm concerned about winter. The stable is adequate for autumn weather, but when the real cold comes..." "That's what I wanted to discuss," Thad said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who'd thought through his words carefully. "I have a proposition that might help both of us." Pastor Hartwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, waiting for Thad to continue. He'd learned during his years in Cedar Falls that mountain folk approached important matters in their own time, like water finding its way around stones. "My cabin's well built, but it's meant for one person," Thad continued. "Winter up there can be hard on a man alone. If something happens, injury, sickness, there's no help coming until spring. And Mrs. Quinn needs proper shelter, somewhere she can contribute rather than just survive on charity. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Crowe?" Thad had rehearsed this conversation during his ride to town, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt clumsy in his mouth. "A practical arrangement. She needs a home. Company isn't the right word. Partnership, maybe? Someone to help with the cabin, cooking, mending. Someone to be there if trouble comes. In exchange, she'd have shelter, food, security through the winter." Pastor Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, studying Thad's weathered face. "You're talking about marriage, Mr. Crowe. I'm talking about survival," Thad replied. "Two people helping each other through a hard season. If that requires a ceremony to make it respectable, so be it. But I want to be clear about terms. Separate quarters. No expectations beyond what two adults might reasonably ask of each other." Companionship, not romance. The pastor had counseled many couples during his career, but this was unlike any marriage proposal he'd encountered. Yet something in Thaddeus Crowe's straightforward manner suggested it might be exactly what Martha Quinn needed. Not a fairy tale romance, but a chance to rebuild her life with dignity intact. Have you spoken to Mrs. Quinn about this? No, sir. Wanted to discuss it with you first, see if you thought the idea had merit. Pastor Hartwell rose and walked to his window, looking out at the church where Martha was probably beginning her morning cleaning routine. She's mentioned her concerns about winter, though she tries not to complain. And I know she's been considering writing to her son in California, though the prospect doesn't seem to bring her much joy. A woman like that shouldn't have to depend on reluctant relatives, Thad said. She's got more backbone than most men I've known. She does indeed. Pastor Hartwell turned back to face Thad. But this is a serious matter. Mr. Crowe, marriage, even a practical arrangement, involves legal and moral obligations. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? Thad had wrestled with that question during the long hours of consideration. I've been alone 15 years, Pastor. Haven't needed anyone or had anyone need me. But I'm not getting younger, and neither is she. Maybe it's time to stop pretending that complete independence is the same thing as strength. The honesty in Thad's voice convinced Pastor Hartwell more than any romantic declaration might have. This was a man who'd examined his own motivations carefully and arrived at a decision based on reason rather than impulse. I think you should speak to her, the pastor said finally. But be gentle, Mr. Crowe. She's proud, but she's also been hurt by circumstances beyond her control. Approach this as you would approach a wounded animal, with patience and respect. Thad found Martha in the church sanctuary, kneeling in the front pew with a charred Bible open before her. The book was one of her few possessions to survive the fire, its leather cover blackened and some pages singed at the edges, but the text still readable. She'd been reading from Ecclesiastes, the passage about there being a time for every purpose under heaven. When she became aware of someone watching her, she turned to see Thaddeus Crowe standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and an expression of careful determination on his weathered face. Sunlight filtered through the church's modest stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the wooden pews and highlighting the silver in his dark hair. Mr. Crowe, she said, closing the Bible and rising gracefully despite the stiffness that came from kneeling on hard wood. Good morning, Ma'am. He stepped into the sanctuary, moving with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in wild places but uncertain in civilized spaces. I wondered if I might have a word with you. Martha smoothed her skirt and nodded toward one of the pews. Of course. Please sit down. They settled beside each other with the careful distance of two people who didn't know each other well. The church's silence broken only by the sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside. Thad studied his hands for a moment, gathering his thoughts, while Martha waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved difficult conversations. Mrs. Quinn, he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man unaccustomed to personal revelations. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about making arrangements for winter. Yes, Martha replied carefully. I'm still considering my options. I'd like to offer you one more option to consider. Thad turned to face her, his gray eyes steady and serious. My cabin up in the mountains is well built, warm, provisioned for winter. It's meant for one person, but there's room for two if they were willing to share the space. Martha's hands folded in her lap, her expression growing more guarded. Mr. Crowe, I appreciate any kindness, but I'm not in a position to accept charity. It wouldn't be charity, Thad interrupted gently. It would be a fair exchange. I need help with the cabin, cooking, mending, keeping house while I'm running trap lines. You need shelter and security. It seems to me we might help each other. Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying his face for any hint of improper intentions. What she saw was the same straightforward honesty that had marked their previous encounters. But underneath it, She sensed something more, a loneliness that matched her own, carefully hidden but unmistakably present. "You're suggesting I come live in your cabin as your housekeeper?" "I'm suggesting a partnership," Thad said. "Two adults helping each other survive what promises to be a hard winter. If you think it needs the blessing of ceremony to be respectable, I'm willing to speak vows. But I want to be clear about terms. Separate quarters, no expectations beyond what two people might reasonably ask of each other." The directness of his proposal left Martha momentarily speechless. In her 64 years, she'd received exactly one marriage proposal, from James Quinn when she was 22, and full of dreams about love and happiness. This was something entirely different, stripped of romance, but offering something perhaps more valuable: honest partnership between equals. "Mr. Crowe," she said slowly, "you don't know anything about me beyond what you've observed in a few brief encounters. I could be a terrible cook, a poor housekeeper, difficult company during long winter evenings." "You could be," Thad agreed. "And I could be impossible to live with. I've been alone so long, I've forgotten how to consider another person's needs. I snore, I talk to myself, I get restless when storms keep me inside too long. But we're both adults who've learned to make the best of imperfect situations." Martha looked down at her charred Bible, thinking of the passage she'd been reading about times and seasons. "Why me, Mr. Crowe? Surely there are younger women in Cedar Falls who might welcome such an arrangement." "Because you're not looking for someone to take care of you," Thad replied. "You're looking for a chance to take care of yourself with dignity. That's something I understand." The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep in Martha's heart. Recognition that this taciturn mountain man saw her not as an object of pity, but as a person of worth facing difficult circumstances. It had been so long since anyone had credited her with strength rather than focusing on her vulnerabilities. "This is a very serious matter. Mr. Crowe, if we were to enter into such an arrangement, it would involve legal and moral obligations." "Yes, ma'am. I've considered that." "And you've spoken to Pastor Hartwell about this?" "I have. He suggested I approach you directly, let you decide if the idea has merit." Martha rose and walked to the altar, her movements graceful despite the weight of the decision before her. The church had been her sanctuary these past months, a place where she could pray for guidance and find temporary peace from the constant worry about her future. Now she was being offered a different kind of sanctuary, one that would require courage and trust in a man she barely knew. "I need time to think," she said finally, turning back to face him. "This isn't a decision to be made lightly." Thad stood as well, accepting her need for consideration with the same patience he applied to hunting, understanding that worthwhile things often required careful stalking rather than hasty pursuit. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be in town through tomorrow if you want to discuss it further." As he moved toward the door, Martha called out to him, "Mr. Crowe, may I ask why you're willing to take on the responsibility of a wife, even a practical one, after so many years of living alone?" Thad paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. "Because I'm tired of pretending that independence and isolation are the same thing, Mrs. Quinn, and because winter is coming whether we face it alone or together." After he left, Martha sank back into the pew and opened her Bible to Ecclesiastes again, but the words blurred as her mind raced through the implications of Thaddeus Crowe's extraordinary proposal. It wasn't love he was offering, but it might be something equally valuable: respect, partnership, and a chance to rebuild her life with her dignity intact. That evening, she sought out Pastor Hartwell in his study, finding him bent over correspondence with churches in other territories. He looked up with a gentle smile as she knocked on his open door. "Martha, come in. I've been expecting you." She settled into the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap with the composure that had served her well through years of teaching unruly students. "Pastor, I assume Mr. Crowe discussed his proposal with you." "He did. A most unusual situation, I'll admit. But then again, frontier life often requires unusual solutions." Pastor Hartwell set aside his pen and gave her his full attention. What are your thoughts? I'm trying to understand his motivations, Martha said honestly. A man doesn't offer marriage, even practical marriage, to a near stranger without compelling reasons. I've known Thaddeus Crowe for several years now, Pastor Hartwell replied. He's a man of his word, quiet but honorable. The war damaged him in ways that don't show on the surface, but he's found peace in those mountains. Perhaps he's ready to share that peace with someone who needs it. And if the arrangement proves unsuitable, if we find we can't tolerate each other's company through a long winter, then you would face that challenge as you've faced all the others life has brought you, with wisdom and grace. Pastor Hartwell leaned forward slightly. Martha, I've watched you these past months, seen how you've maintained your dignity despite circumstances that would have broken many people. You have strength, and perhaps Thaddeus Crowe recognizes that strength as something he needs in his life. Martha was quiet for a moment, considering the pastor's words. He mentioned separate quarters, no expectations beyond reasonable partnership, a wise approach, I think. Marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose has as much chance of success as marriage built on passion that fades with time. You think I should accept his proposal? Pastor Hartwell smiled gently. I think you should follow your heart, but also use the practical wisdom that has served you well throughout your life. Winter is indeed coming, and few of us are strong enough to face all of life's challenges entirely alone. That night, lying on her straw bed in the church stable, Martha stared up at the rough wooden beams and listened to the wind beginning to carry the promise of snow. She thought about her son Richard in California, about the reluctant duty that might compel him to offer her shelter and the daily humiliation of being an unwanted dependent. She thought about Thaddeus Crowe's steady grey eyes and his frank admission that he was tired of pretending independence and isolation were the same thing. Most of all, she thought about the charred Bible lying beside her pillow, about the passage in Ecclesiastes that spoke of a time for every purpose under heaven. Perhaps this was her time for taking chances, for trusting in the possibility that two lonely people might create something better together than either could manage alone. When morning came, Martha Quinn had made her decision. Martha found Thaddeus Crowe at Morrison's store the next morning, examining a new shipment of winter supplies with the methodical attention of a man who understood that careful preparation often meant the difference between comfort and catastrophe during a mountain winter. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral, though she caught a flicker of something, hope perhaps, or simply curiosity about her decision. Mr. Crowe, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to. I've given your proposal careful consideration. Thad set down the wool blanket he'd been examining and gave her his full attention. Around them, the store's morning customers continued their business, but Martha felt as though they stood in a circle of profound quiet, about to cross a threshold that would change both their lives irrevocably. And, he asked simply, I accept your terms, Martha said, lifting her chin slightly in the gesture he was beginning to recognize as her way of facing difficult situations with dignity intact. A practical arrangement, separate quarters, partnership based on mutual need and respect. Something shifted in Thad's weathered face, not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes that suggested relief and perhaps even gratitude. Thank you, Mrs. Quinn. I believe this arrangement will serve us both well. The wedding ceremony took place that afternoon in the small church, with Pastor Hartwell officiating and Samuel Morrison and his wife serving as witnesses. It was a brief, practical affair. No flowers, no music, no celebration beyond the simple exchange of vows that legally bound two strangers together in matrimony. Martha wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she'd carefully mended and pressed, while Thad had brushed the trail dust from his clothes and slicked back his graying hair with water from the church well. The vows they spoke were traditional in form, but carried an undertone of businesslike agreement that would have seemed strange to romantic ears. When Pastor Hartwell pronounced them husband and wife, Thad offered Martha his arm with the same courteous formality he might have shown to any respectable lady, and she accepted it with equal reserve. There was no kiss to seal their union. That intimacy belonged to a different kind of marriage than the one they were embarking upon. The townspeople who witnessed their departure from Cedar Falls would later describe it as the most unusual wedding party they'd ever seen. A mountain man and a church-dwelling widow setting off together on mules loaded with household goods. Their conversation limited to practical matters about the trail ahead and the weather that threatened to turn before evening. Martha's few possessions were easily loaded onto Gideon's pack frame, her charred Bible, a carpet bag containing her extra clothing, a hand-sewn quilt that had survived the fire, and a small wooden box holding her late husband's wedding ring and a few family photographs. Everything she had left of her former life could be carried on one mule, a stark reminder of how completely circumstances had stripped away the accumulations of 64 years. The trail to Thad's cabin wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, following creek beds and switchbacks that tested both human and animal endurance. Martha rode one of Morrison's mules, a steady creature named Belle that had been chosen for her calm temperament rather than her speed. She sat the saddle with the straight posture of a woman who'd learned to face challenges without complaint, though Thad could see the strain in her shoulders as they climbed higher into country she'd never seen. "Another hour," he said during one of their rest stops, offering her water from his canteen. "Trail gets steeper, but we're almost to the meadow where I pasture the animals." Martha accepted the water gratefully, studying the wild landscape around them with eyes that were beginning to appreciate its austere beauty. "It's magnificent country," she said, returning the canteen. "Harsh but magnificent, honest country," Thad replied, checking the pack animals' loads before they resumed their climb. "It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." The simple profundity of his observation struck Martha as emblematic of the man himself, someone who'd learned to value truth over comfort, substance over appearance. She was beginning to understand that her new husband operated according to principles that had been stripped of social pretense and reduced to their essential core: honesty, self-reliance, and respect for the realities that governed survival in unforgiving places. When they finally crested the ridge and Martha caught her first glimpse of Thad's homestead, she felt a mixture of relief and trepidation that she carefully kept from showing on her face. The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines, its log walls chinked with clay and its shake roof designed to shed the heavy snows that would soon blanket this high country. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence of the fire Thad had banked before leaving for town, and the windows glowed with the warm yellow light of oil lamps. It was a larger structure than she'd expected, built with the careful craftsmanship of a man who understood that shoddy work could prove fatal when winter storms isolated the cabin for weeks at a time. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides of the building, providing shelter from weather and space for the countless tasks that frontier life required. Behind the cabin, she could see a sturdy barn, a root cellar built into the hillside, and neat stacks of firewood that represented months of patient labor. "It's a good place," Martha said as they dismounted near the porch, her words carrying genuine appreciation for what Thad had built with his own hands. "Been home for 15 years, Thad replied, beginning to unload the pack animals with efficient movements. "Built it to last, built it to keep a person alive when the mountain tries to kill them." The interior of the cabin revealed the same attention to practical detail that characterized its exterior. The main room served multiple functions: kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and providing both heat and cooking facilities. Handmade furniture crafted from local timber filled the space: a sturdy table and chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, a comfortable chair positioned near the fireplace for evening reading. Thad led Martha to the bedroom he'd prepared for her use, a small but clean space that had clearly been his own sleeping quarters. A narrow bed covered with woolen blankets occupied one wall, while a simple dresser and washstand provided storage and basic amenities. A window looked out toward the meadow where he pastured his animals, offering a view that would be beautiful in summer and reassuring in winter when knowing the livestock were safe became crucial to peace of mind. "I'll be sleeping in the main room," Thad explained, setting her carpetbag on the bed. "Built myself a sleeping alcove behind the bookshelf. Gives us both privacy while keeping the cabin warm." Martha examined her new quarters with the practical eye of a woman who'd learned to make the best of whatever circumstances offered. The room was clean, adequately furnished, and offered more comfort than she'd enjoyed since losing her home to fire. More importantly, it represented security, a place where she could establish routines, contribute meaningfully to the household, and face the coming winter without fear of want or homelessness. "This will do very well," she said, beginning to unpack her few belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making a home wherever circumstances required. "Thank you for your thoughtfulness in preparing it." Their first evening together established patterns that would define their unusual marriage for months to come. Martha prepared supper from supplies Thad had laid in. Venison he'd killed and smoked, vegetables from his small garden, bread she baked in the Dutch oven that hung from the fireplace crane. Thad tended to the animals and completed the dozens of small tasks that mountain living required, then joined her for a meal eaten by lamplight while wind sighed through the pines outside. Conversation came slowly, like water seeping through stone, as two people who'd grown accustomed to solitude learned to share thoughts and observations with another human being. They spoke of practical matters, the approaching weather, needed repairs to the barn roof, Martha's plans for organizing the cabin's domestic arrangements. But underneath the surface practicalities, each was taking the measure of the other, learning the small habits and preferences that would either smooth or complicate their shared existence. Martha discovered that Thad was a man of regular routines who rose before dawn, read voraciously despite his limited formal education, and possessed a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments. He learned that she brought order to everything she touched without being fussy about it, that her years as a teacher had given her patience with difficult situations, and that she could maintain comfortable silence without feeling compelled to fill every pause with unnecessary words. After supper, they sat before the fire while Martha mended one of Thad's shirts, the first of many domestic tasks she would undertake to earn her place in their partnership. The firelight played across her face as she worked, highlighting the good bones and intelligent eyes that had attracted James Quinn 37 years earlier, while Thad whittled a piece of pine into something that might eventually become a useful tool or simply occupy his hands while his mind processed the remarkable changes that had entered his ordered existence. "Mrs. Crowe," he said eventually. Testing the sound of her new name in the quiet cabin, Martha looked up from her sewing, a slight smile touching her lips at hearing herself addressed by a name that was both familiar and strange. "Yes, Mr. Crowe? This arrangement, it's going to take some adjusting for both of us. If something doesn't suit you, if you need changes made, speak up. No point in being miserable when solutions might be possible." "The same applies to you," Martha replied, returning to her mending. "I've been living according to my own preferences for months now. I may need reminding about accommodating another person's needs." It was a practical conversation between practical people, but it established the foundation of mutual consideration that would allow their unusual marriage to function. Neither harbored romantic illusions about their arrangement, but both understood that success would require patience, flexibility, and honest communication about difficulties as they arose. When the evening grew late and the fire burned down to glowing coals, they retired to their separate quarters with polite good nights and careful attention to each other's privacy. Martha lay in her narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, Wind in the pines, the settling of log walls, the distant call of an owl hunting in the meadow. It was so different from the town sounds she'd grown accustomed to during her months at the church that she might have been sleeping on another planet. In the main room, Thad settled into his sleeping alcove and stared up at the rough-hewn beams of his cabin ceiling, marveling at how completely his solitary existence had been transformed in the space of a single day. For 15 years, his cabin had been sanctuary from a world that had wounded him, a place where he could exist without consideration for anyone else's needs or judgments. Now it sheltered another person, someone whose presence would require him to remember social graces he'd deliberately forgotten and accommodate rhythms of life beyond his own. Yet, as he listened to Martha moving quietly in her room, arranging her few possessions, settling into bed, murmuring what might have been a prayer, Thad felt something he hadn't experienced in many years, the comfort of knowing that another human being shared his shelter, that he was no longer the only life struggling to survive in this beautiful, harsh country. The wind picked up during the night, rattling the windows and moaning through the pine boughs with the voice of approaching winter. But inside the cabin, two lonely people slept peacefully for the first time in months, protected not only by sturdy walls and careful preparation, but by the knowledge that they no longer faced the world entirely alone. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded with the careful politeness of two strangers learning to share confined space, each mindful of the other's need for privacy and routine. Martha rose early to prepare breakfast before Thad began his daily rounds of the property, checking on livestock and maintaining the countless details that kept a mountain homestead functioning. He would return to find hot coffee waiting and a meal that transformed his simple provisions into something approaching comfort. Martha's influence on the cabin was subtle but unmistakable. Surfaces that had been merely functional became clean and organized. Torn clothing found itself mended, missing buttons replaced, frayed edges carefully darned. The oil lamps burned brighter because she trimmed their wicks properly, and the cabin stayed warmer because she understood how to bank the fire to last through the night without wasting precious fuel. More significantly, she brought order to Thad's haphazard record-keeping, organizing his accounts and supply lists with the methodical precision of someone who'd managed a schoolroom for 15 years. She discovered that despite his careful preparations, he'd been dangerously casual about tracking his stores, an oversight that could prove costly. During a hard winter when every pound of flour and every candle mattered, you have enough supplies for 2 people through March, she announced, one morning over breakfast, consulting the inventory she'd compiled. But only if we're careful about portions and don't waste anything. Thad looked up from his coffee, surprised by her thoroughness. You've been through everything. Everything in the root cellar, the pantry, and the barn, Martha confirmed. I've taught school in communities where families went hungry because they didn't plan properly. I won't let that happen to us. The quiet authority in her voice reminded Thad that Martha Quinn, now Martha Crowe, had spent decades taking responsibility for other people's welfare. She understood survival not just as an individual challenge, but as a communal effort requiring careful resource management and planning. It was a skill that complemented his knowledge of hunting and trapping, creating a partnership that was genuinely stronger than either person could achieve alone. As October deepened into November, the first serious snows began to dust the high peaks visible from their cabin windows. Thad spent longer hours checking his trap lines, taking advantage of the last weeks before winter locked the high country in ice and snow. Martha used these periods of solitude to explore the cabin more thoroughly, discovering evidence of the man she'd married in details he probably didn't realize he'd revealed, hidden in a wooden trunk beneath his sleeping alcove. She found his old army uniform, blue wool with sergeant's stripes, carefully preserved, but bearing the stains and repairs that spoke of hard service. The brass buttons had been polished until they gleamed, but the fabric showed the careful mending of someone who'd learned to maintain his equipment under difficult conditions. Folded beneath the uniform were letters from his family, written in fading ink on paper that crumbled at the edges, and a daguerreotype of a young woman who must have been his first wife. Martha studied the photograph for a long moment, seeing in Catherine Crowe's face the youthful hope that had probably attracted Thad before the war changed him into someone else entirely. The woman in the picture looked soft, protected, someone who'd expected life to unfold according to familiar patterns of courtship, marriage, and domestic happiness. Martha understood why that marriage had failed, not from any fault in either person, but because war had created unbridgeable distance between the man who'd left for battle and the stranger who'd returned. She carefully returned everything to the trunk, exactly as she'd found it, understanding that these remnants of Thad's past were both too precious and too painful for casual handling. But the discovery helped her understand why he'd chosen isolation over attempting to rebuild relationships with people who remembered him as someone he could never be. Again, her own memories lived in fewer physical objects, but were no less present in their daily life together. The charred Bible remained on her bedside table, its damaged cover a constant reminder of how quickly security could vanish in flame and smoke. Sometimes she caught herself unconsciously touching her wedding ring, not the simple band Thad had placed on her finger during their ceremony, but the worn gold circle she wore on her right hand, the one that had bound her to James Quinn through 37. Years of shared hopes and disappointments. The nights were when their carefully maintained distance became most evident and most difficult to sustain. They sat before the fire after supper, Martha with her mending and Thad with his whittling or a book, the silence between them comfortable but charged with awareness of each other's presence. Sometimes Martha would look up from her work to find Thad watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Not desire, exactly, but a kind of wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe another person shared his sanctuary. For his part, Thad found himself hyper-aware of Martha's movements throughout the cabin, the soft sound of her humming while she worked, the rustle of her skirts as she moved between kitchen and sitting room. After 15 years of solitude, another person's presence was like a constant low-level sensation that kept him slightly off balance. Not unpleasantly, but with the recognition that his ordered existence had acquired an unpredictable element that would require ongoing adjustment. The first real test of their arrangement came during a 3-day blizzard that struck in mid-November, trapping them inside the cabin with wind howling around the walls and snow piling against the windows until daylight became a dim, grey suggestion rather than actual illumination. Thad had weathered many such storms alone, reading and maintaining equipment while waiting for the weather to break. But sharing confined space with another person during enforced idleness proved more challenging than either had anticipated. By the second day, Martha's careful organization began to chafe against Thad's more relaxed approach to household order. She found his habit of leaving tools wherever he'd last used them frustrating, while he discovered that her need to maintain rigid schedules felt constraining after years of following only his own inclinations. The breaking point came over something trivial: Thad's practice of reading at the kitchen table during meals. A solitary habit that Martha found rude, now that they shared their table with another person. Her polite request that he save his reading for after supper was met with mild resistance that escalated into their first real disagreement. "I've eaten my meals with a book for 15 years, Thad said, his voice carrying an edge of irritation that Martha hadn't heard before. "It's a harmless habit." "It was harmless when you lived alone," Martha replied, her own patience wearing thin after days of careful accommodation. "Now it's discourteous to your dinner companion." "Dinner companion?" Thad set down his book with more force than necessary. "I thought we agreed this was a practical arrangement, not a social occasion." The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from a green fire, acrid, stinging, impossible to ignore. Martha felt color rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the sharp realization that their careful politeness had been masking fundamental questions about what they actually expected from each other. "You're quite right. Mr. Crowe," she said, rising from the table with dignity intact, despite the hurt in her voice. "I apologize for imposing social expectations on our business arrangement." She retreated to her bedroom, leaving Thad alone with his book and the uncomfortable realization that his thoughtless words had wounded someone who'd done nothing but try to make their unconventional marriage work. The cabin felt different with Martha's presence withdrawn. Not emptier, exactly, but charged with the tension of unresolved conflict. That evening, they maintained separate spheres within the small cabin, Martha staying in her room with her mending, while Thad sat before the fire alone. The silence that had once felt comfortable now seemed brittle, ready to shatter at the first careless word or gesture. Both understood that they stood at a crossroads that would define the success or failure of their arrangement. They could retreat into formal politeness that maintained peace at the cost of genuine connection, or they could find a way to bridge the gap between practical partnership and something approaching real companionship. The resolution came, unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, when Thad woke to the sound of Martha crying. Not the dramatic sobs of theatrical grief, but the quiet, hopeless weeping of someone who thought herself unheard and unobserved. He lay in his sleeping alcove, listening to the soft sounds of her distress, understanding with sudden clarity that his careless words had struck deeper than he'd realized. Martha Quinn Crowe was not a woman who cried easily. Her years as a teacher had schooled her in maintaining composure under pressure, and her recent struggles had only strengthened her determination to face hardship without complaint. But the combination of isolation, uncertainty about her future, and Thad's reminder that their marriage was merely a business transaction had overwhelmed. Defenses already weakened by months of loss and displacement. Thad rose quietly and moved through the darkened cabin to stand outside Martha's door, his hand raised to knock before hesitation stopped him. They'd been careful to respect each other's privacy, but privacy could become a wall that prevented the very connection that might make their arrangement bearable for both of them. "Mrs. Crowe?" he said softly, his voice barely audible through the wooden door. The crying stopped immediately, followed by the sound of Martha hastily composing herself. "Yes, I owe you an apology," Thad said, leaning against the doorframe. "What I said earlier, about this being just a practical arrangement that was thoughtless and unkind." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind moving through the pine boughs outside. When Martha finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. "You were only stating the truth, Mr. Crowe. I had no right to expect more than we agreed upon." "Maybe not," Thad replied. "But I'm beginning to think what we agreed upon isn't enough for either of us to be satisfied with. We're going to spend the winter together, whether we like each other or not. Seems to me we might as well try to like each other." Another silence, then the soft sound of footsteps approaching the door. When Martha opened it, Thad saw that her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was composed, dignified even in her distress. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Crowe?" "That we stop being so careful about keeping our distance," Thad said. "We're married for better or worse, practical arrangement or not. Maybe it's time we acted like partners instead of polite strangers." Martha studied his face in the lamplight, seeing in his weathered features a sincerity that his earlier harsh words had temporarily obscured. "And what would that look like exactly?" "I don't know," Thad admitted with characteristic honesty. "I've been alone so long, I've forgotten how to compromise with another person. But I'm willing to learn if you are." Martha was quiet for a moment, considering his offer and what it might mean for both of them. Finally she nodded. "I'd like that, Mr. Crowe. I'd like that very much." When morning came, they shared breakfast with a different quality of attention to each other, as though the previous night's conversation had removed an invisible barrier that had been keeping them at arm's length. Thad still read during meals, but he also talked about what he was reading, sharing observations and asking Martha's opinions in a way that transformed solitary habit into shared experience. The blizzard broke on the third day, revealing a world transformed by snow and brilliant with reflected sunlight. As they stood together on the cabin porch, breathing the crystalline air and marveling at the beauty of their mountain sanctuary, both understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. They were no longer simply two people sharing shelter for mutual convenience. They were beginning the slow and careful work of building something that neither had dared hope for when they'd spoken their practical vows in the Cedar Falls church. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was the foundation upon which love might eventually be built. Respect, honest communication, and the willingness to see past the careful walls they'd both constructed around their wounded hearts. December arrived with a series of storms that buried the high country under snow deeper than Martha had ever imagined possible. The cabin became their entire world, its warm interior, an island of life and light, surrounded by a landscape that had been simplified to its most essential elements: white snow, dark trees, and the grey sky that promised more weather to come. Their nearest neighbors lived 20 miles away in the valley, and the trails that connected Thad's homestead to the outside world would remain impassable until spring melt opened the passes again. The enforced intimacy of deep winter brought out qualities in both Martha and Thad that their careful courtship had only hinted at. Martha revealed herself to be not only organized and capable, but possessed of a quiet humor that emerged during the long evenings when conversation wandered from practical matters to stories of their past lives. She told him about her years in the schoolroom, the satisfactions and frustrations of shaping young minds, the small victories that made teaching worthwhile, and the heartbreaks that came with watching some children struggle. Despite every effort to help them succeed, Thad found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for years, not the traumatic experiences that had driven him to seek solitude, but earlier recollections of growing up in the Tennessee hills, learning woodcraft from his father, the simple pleasures of a boyhood spent in wild country. Martha was a gifted listener, asking questions that drew out details he'd forgotten he remembered, making him see his own life as something worth talking about rather than simply enduring. Their daily routines evolved into a kind of domestic dance, each learning to anticipate the other's needs and preferences. Martha discovered that Thad was at his best in the early morning hours, rising before dawn to tend the fire and check on the animals with an energy that flagged as the day wore on. She adjusted her own schedule accordingly, preparing hearty breakfasts that would sustain him through the physical labor his homestead required, and saving conversation-heavy activities for the evenings when he was more receptive to company. Thad learned that Martha needed periods of solitude to maintain her equilibrium, that her years of managing classrooms full of children had taught her to cherish quiet moments when she could think without interruption. He made sure she had such times, taking on tasks that would keep him occupied outside the cabin or in the barn when he sensed she needed space to herself. One particularly memorable evening, Martha discovered a pressed wildflower tucked between the pages of her charred Bible, a delicate purple bloom that had somehow survived the fire that destroyed her home. She sat holding it in the lamplight, marveling at this small miracle of preservation, when Thad noticed her absorption. "What have you found there?" he asked, looking up from the harness he was mending. Martha showed him the flower, its papery petals still retaining hints of their original color despite the trauma it had endured. "It was pressed in Psalms," she said softly. "I have no memory of putting it there, but here it is. Something beautiful that survived when everything else was lost." Thad studied the delicate bloom with the careful attention he usually reserved for reading weather signs or tracking animals. "Mountain aster," he said finally, "grows wild in the high meadows, blooms late in the season when most other flowers have given up. Tough little thing, like us perhaps," Martha said, carefully placing the flower back in her Bible. "Still blooming after everything tried to destroy us." The observation hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither quite dared to explore fully. But Thad felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that Martha's presence in his life was becoming less about practical necessity and more about something that felt dangerously close to contentment, their growing comfort with each other. manifested in small ways that would have been invisible to outside observers, but felt significant to two people. Learning to trust again, Martha began leaving her hair down in the evenings, instead of maintaining the severe bun she'd worn during her public life. Thad found himself taking more care with his appearance, trimming his beard more regularly and changing into clean shirts for their evening meals together. They developed shared jokes and references, the kind of private communication that married couples create over time. When the wind howled particularly fiercely around the cabin walls, Martha would comment that the mountain is having strong opinions tonight, and Thad would respond that they should listen respectfully, but not take it personally. These small intimacies of language created a sense of partnership that went beyond their original practical agreement. But it was during a dangerous incident in late December that their relationship shifted into something neither had anticipated when they'd spoken their careful vows in Cedar Falls. Thad had gone to check on the livestock during a brief break in a week-long storm. Following a trail he could navigate blindfolded through snow that came up to his thighs. The barn was only 50 yards from the cabin, but in blizzard conditions it might as well have been 50 miles. He'd been gone longer than usual when Martha began to worry. The storm had resumed with renewed fury, and the afternoon light was failing early as it did during deep winter. Standing at the kitchen window, she could barely make out the shape of the barn through the driving snow, much less determine whether Thad was still there or had started back to the cabin. An hour passed, then another. Martha fought the urge to go looking for him, understanding that she would likely become lost herself and create a larger problem rather than solving the existing one. But as full darkness fell and still no sign of Thad appeared, her worry transformed into something approaching panic. She had just decided to brave the storm, despite the risks, when she heard a sound that made her heart stop, a faint call for help, barely audible above the wind's howling. Grabbing a lantern and wrapping herself in Thad's heavy coat, Martha plunged into the storm, following the sound toward what she hoped was its source. She found him 20 yards from the cabin, collapsed in a drift, where he'd fallen when exhaustion and disorientation overcame his usual sure navigation of familiar territory. His left leg was twisted beneath him at an angle that suggested injury, and his face was pale with cold and pain when the lantern light revealed his condition. "Damn fool," he muttered through chattering teeth, though whether he was cursing himself or the circumstances was unclear. "Twisted my ankle in a snow hole, couldn't get back up." Martha didn't waste time on recriminations or detailed questions. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, she got Thad's arm around her shoulders and half-carried, half-dragged him through the snow to the cabin. It was brutal work that left them both gasping by the time they reached the porch. But adrenaline and determination proved sufficient to the task. Inside, Martha helped Thad to his chair by the fire and immediately began the process of warming him safely, removing his wet boots and socks, wrapping him in dry blankets, preparing hot coffee with a generous addition of whiskey from the medicinal bottle he kept for emergencies. Only when his shivering had stopped and color had returned to his face did she turn her attention to his injured ankle. The examination revealed a severe sprain rather than a break, painful but not permanently damaging if treated properly. Martha had learned basic medical care during her teaching years. Small communities expected their schoolmasters to serve multiple roles, and she wrapped Thad's ankle with strips torn from clean cloth, then elevated it on a cushioned stool. "You saved my life," Thad said simply, as Martha fussed over his makeshift bandages. "If you hadn't come looking for me—" "Nonsense," Martha replied briskly, though her hands shook slightly as she worked. "You would have made it back on your own eventually." "No," Thad said, catching her hand in his to still her nervous movements. "I was getting confused out there, losing track of direction. The cold was making me stupid. If you hadn't found me when you did, I would have frozen to death 20 yards from my own front door." Martha looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered from years of hard use, hers softer but marked by the calluses of domestic work. The touch was the first truly intimate contact they'd shared since their wedding handshake, and it sent an unexpected warmth through her body that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "I couldn't bear to lose you," she said quietly, the admission slipping out before she could consider its implications. "Not when I've just found you?" Thad's grip on her hand tightened, and when she looked up, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not desire exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of a man who'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care, whether he lived or died. "Martha," he said, her given name sounding different in his voice than it ever had before. "I don't say anything you might regret," Martha interrupted gently, though she didn't pull her hand away. "We're both shaken by what happened. Let's not make declarations we might not mean in the clear light of morning." But even as she cautioned against hasty words, Martha felt something fundamental had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained since their wedding had collapsed in the face of real fear and genuine care. Whatever they'd built together over the past months, it was no longer simply a practical arrangement between strangers. Thad's ankle kept him housebound for the next 2 weeks, a period that proved revelatory for both of them. Forced to accept Martha's care and attention, Thad discovered that being looked after didn't necessarily mean losing independence. Martha, meanwhile, found satisfaction in nursing him back to health that went beyond simple duty or even Christian charity. She brought him meals on a tray, changed his bandages with gentle efficiency, and entertained him with stories and conversation during the long hours when movement was painful and boredom threatened. Thad proved to be a surprisingly good patient, grateful for her ministrations without being demanding, patient with his temporary limitations without becoming self-pitying. More significantly, his injury created opportunities for conversation that their usual busy routines hadn't allowed. With nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do beyond basic cabin maintenance that Martha could handle, they talked more openly than they ever had about their fears, their regrets, and their tentative hopes for whatever future they might build together. It was during one of these conversations that Martha finally spoke directly about what both of them had been carefully avoiding: the growing affection that was transforming their practical marriage into something more complicated and potentially more rewarding. "Thaddeus," she said one evening as she prepared to change his bandages, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." Thad looked up from the book he'd been reading, recognizing the serious tone that meant Martha had been thinking about something important. "Ask away. When we married, we agreed this would be a practical arrangement, companionship and mutual assistance, nothing more. But I think that's changing for both of us. The question is, are we going to acknowledge it or pretend it isn't happening?" The directness of her question caught Thad off guard, though he realized he shouldn't have been surprised. Martha had always favored honest communication over polite evasion, and their recent crisis had stripped away the last pretenses that allowed them to ignore what was growing between them. "You're right," he said finally, setting aside his book and giving her his full attention. "It is changing. The question is whether that's something we both want or just something that's happened to us." Martha settled into the chair beside him, her hands busy with the clean bandages, but her attention focused on his face. "I've been thinking about that. When James died, I believed I was finished with marriage, finished with caring about anyone in that way. It seemed safer to accept loneliness than risk being hurt again. And now I find myself caring very much whether you come back safely from checking the livestock," Martha said with a slight smile. "I worry about you when you're gone longer than expected. I look forward to our conversations in the evening. I've started thinking of this cabin as our home, rather than your home where I'm temporarily staying." Thad was quiet for a moment, processing her words and the courage it had taken to speak them so plainly. "I haven't cared about another person's well-being in 15 years, he said finally. "Told myself I was better off that way, that caring just led to disappointment and loss. But when I was lying in that snowdrift, the thing that kept me from giving up wasn't fear of dying. It was the thought of leaving you alone, of what my death would do to you. So we both care, Martha said, beginning to unwrap his ankle with gentle movements. The question is what we do about it. What do you want to do about it? Martha paused in her work, considering her answer carefully. I want to stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. I want to acknowledge that we're building something real here, something that matters to both of us. But I also want to be honest about our limitations. What limitations? We're not young people driven by passion, Martha said practically. We're adults who've been hurt and learned caution. Whatever this becomes, it needs to be built on truth rather than romantic fantasies. Thad nodded, appreciating her realistic approach to their situation. So we take it slowly, see where it leads without forcing anything. Exactly. Martha finished rewrapping his ankle and sat back to examine her work. We're already married, after all. We have time to figure out what kind of marriage we want to have. That conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. Still careful, still respectful of boundaries, but acknowledging the growing emotional investment they both had in making their partnership succeed. They began sharing more personal stories, more intimate observations about their daily life together, more honest reactions to the small conflicts and accommodations that shared living required. When Thad's ankle healed sufficiently for him to resume his normal activities, their routines included more deliberate moments of connection. They established the habit of sitting together by the fire each evening, talking about their day or reading aloud to each other from books in Thad's small but carefully chosen library. Martha discovered that despite his lack of formal education, Thad was remarkably well-read, with particular interests in natural, history and exploration narratives that reflected his love of wild country, the physical awareness that had been carefully suppressed since their wedding also began to surface in small ways. Martha found herself noticing the way Thad's hands moved when he worked on his carving projects, the quiet strength evident in his movements despite his recent injury. Thad caught himself watching Martha as she went about her domestic tasks, appreciating the grace and efficiency of her movements, the way lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, but they moved toward greater intimacy with the caution of people who'd learned that rushing could destroy delicate things before they had a chance to fully develop. Neither wanted to risk damaging what they'd built by pushing too hard or expecting too much too quickly. The deep winter continued around them. But inside their cabin, warmth and light and growing affection created a sanctuary that felt increasingly like the home both had thought they'd lost forever. They were no longer simply two lonely people sharing shelter. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, building something together that neither could have created alone. As January gave way to February and the deep cold of mountain winter settled over their valley, like a presence with weight and substance, Thad began expressing his growing affection for Martha in the only way he knew how, through the work of his hands. In the evenings after supper, while Martha mended clothes or read by the fire, he would sit with his whittling knife and pieces of pine or aspen, carving small gifts that appeared on her bedside table or beside her place at breakfast. First came a wooden comb to replace the broken one she'd been making do with since the fire, carved from a piece of cherry wood he'd been saving for years. The teeth were perfectly spaced and smooth as silk, a testament to hours of patient work that transformed a simple utilitarian object into something approaching art. When Martha discovered it beside her morning coffee, tears sprang to her eyes, not just for the gift itself, but for the care and attention it represented. It's beautiful. "Thaddeus," she said, running her fingers over the wood's satiny surface. "Too beautiful for everyday use." "Beautiful things should be used," Thad replied, embarrassed by her emotional response, but pleased by it as well. "What's the point of beauty if it just sits on a shelf?" The comb was followed by other small treasures, a wooden box with a fitted lid to hold her few pieces of jewelry, a set of measuring spoons carved from maple burl, a bookmark fashioned from a thin piece of walnut and inlaid with tiny fragments of quartz he'd found in the creek bed. Each gift revealed not only skill with his knife, but careful observation of Martha's needs and preferences. Martha found herself treasuring these tokens, not just for their craftsmanship, but for what they revealed about the man who made them. Each piece showed Thad's growing understanding of her daily routines, his attention to details she hadn't realized anyone noticed, his desire to bring small comforts into her life. The gifts were love letters written in wood and stone, more eloquent than any words he might have spoken. As winter deepened and their isolation became complete, no visitors, no contact with the outside world, no distractions from each other's company, Martha began paying more attention to her appearance in ways she hadn't bothered with since James's death. She started wearing her hair in softer styles, taking care with the arrangement of her simple dresses, adding small touches that made her feel more feminine despite their wilderness circumstances. Thad noticed these changes with the same attention to detail that made him such a successful hunter and trapper. The way Martha had begun to let her hair fall loose around her shoulders in the evenings, the subtle adjustments to necklines and sleeve lengths that flattered her still graceful figure, the increased care she took with the small rituals of daily grooming. These observations stirred feelings he'd kept carefully buried for years, not just desire, though that was part of it, but a deeper recognition of Martha as a woman rather than simply a useful partner. Their conversations during these long winter evenings grew more personal and revealing. Martha told him about her childhood dreams of becoming a writer, ambitions that had been set aside for the more practical concerns of teaching and marriage, but had never entirely disappeared. She still had notebooks filled with stories and observations, ideas for articles about frontier life that she thought might interest Eastern magazines. I used to imagine my name on the cover of Harper's or Atlantic Monthly, she admitted one evening, her voice carrying a mixture of wistfulness and embarrassment. Foolish dreams for a school teacher from Illinois. Not foolish, Thad said firmly. You have a way with words, a way of seeing things that most people miss. Maybe it's not too late to try again. His encouragement surprised Martha, who'd grown accustomed to having her literary ambitions dismissed as impractical feminine fancies. James had been supportive but patronizing, treating her writing as a harmless hobby rather than a serious pursuit. Thad's response suggested he saw her as someone capable of achievements beyond domestic competence. Thad, in turn, began sharing stories about his own dreams, the plans he'd had before the war for buying land, raising horses, building something lasting that could be passed on to children. The war had shattered those dreams, along with so much else. But talking to Martha about them helped him realize that some aspirations might be resurrected, even if they took different forms than originally imagined. "I've got good pasture land here," he said one evening, gesturing toward the windows that showed nothing but snow-covered darkness. "Come spring, I could run a small herd of horses, breed them for mountain work. There's always demand for sure-footed animals that can handle rough country." "That sounds like a wonderful plan," Martha encouraged. "You know horses, you know this country. It makes perfect sense." These conversations about future possibilities created an intimacy that went beyond their growing physical awareness of each other. They were beginning to dream together, to envision a shared future that extended beyond simply surviving the current winter. The shift from short-term survival partnership to long-term life planning represented a fundamental change in how they viewed their marriage, but it was during a trip to Cedar Falls in late February, their first venture into the outside world since November, that they realized how completely their relationship had changed in the eyes of others as well as themselves. The town was locked in winter's grip, its streets filled with snow, and its residents eager for any distraction from the monotony of cold weather. Confinement, their arrival created a minor sensation among the townspeople who'd been starved for news and gossip during the isolated winter months. Samuel Morrison greeted them with enthusiasm that had as much to do with boredom as genuine pleasure at seeing customers, while Pastor Hartwell invited them to stay for supper and an evening of conversation that would break the tedium of another quiet February night. But it was the reactions of the town's women that proved most revealing about how their relationship appeared to outside observers. Mrs. Morrison and the other ladies who gathered at the store during their visit treated Martha not as the desperate widow who'd been living in the church stable, but as a married woman who'd clearly found contentment in her unusual union. "You look wonderful, Martha," Mrs. Morrison observed, studying her with the sharp eye of someone who noticed changes in personal appearance. "Mountain life seems to agree with you." "It does," Martha replied with a smile that surprised her with its sincerity. "Very much." The women exchanged glances that suggested they were drawing their own conclusions about what had happened between the practical arrangement that had been formalized in their church and the obviously harmonious partnership that had returned to their community. When one of the younger women asked directly whether Martha was happy in her marriage, her answer came without hesitation. "Happier than I expected to be at this stage of my life," she said, glancing toward where Thad was discussing trapline conditions with the other men. "Mr. Crowe is a good man, and we suit each other well." The conversation continued in that vein throughout their visit, with Martha fielding questions about their domestic arrangements, and Thad receiving good-natured ribbing from the men about the obvious improvement in his appearance and demeanor. Both of them were struck by how naturally they fell into the role of a married couple, how easily they supported each other in social situations, how comfortable they felt representing themselves as partners rather than individuals. The ride back to their cabin gave them opportunity to discuss what they'd observed about themselves and each other during their first public appearance. "As a married couple, we did well together today," Martha observed as their horses picked their way carefully along the snow-packed trail. "It felt natural being part of a couple again." "It did," Thad agreed. "I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone on my side in a room full of people, someone I could count on to understand my reactions even when I didn't explain them." "Is that what marriage is to you? Having someone on your side?" Thad considered the question as they rode through the forest of snow-laden pines, their horses' breath creating clouds in the crystal-clear air. "Part of it, anyway. But it's more than that now. It's having someone whose happiness matters to you, someone you want to protect and provide for, not because you have to, but because their well-being has become part of your own." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, recognizing in them an expression of love that was all the more meaningful for being stated so simply and honestly. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. "Your happiness has become important to me in ways I didn't expect when we first made our arrangement." That evening, back in their cabin with the fire crackling and oil lamps casting their warm glow over familiar surroundings, they sat closer together than they ever had before, not touching, but near enough that Martha could smell the pine scent that always clung to Thad's clothes, near enough that he could see the way firelight brought out the gold highlights in her hair. "Martha," Thad said suddenly, setting aside the harness he'd been mending, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from her sewing, recognizing the serious tone that meant he'd been thinking about something important. "What is it?" "When we married, I told you this would be separate quarters, no expectations beyond companionship. But that's not what I want anymore." He paused, gathering courage for words that felt more dangerous than any enemy fire he'd faced during the war. "I want a real marriage with you. I want to share a bed, a life, everything that husband and wife can share. But only if that's what you want too." Martha set down her needlework and studied his face in the lamplight, seeing vulnerability there that took courage to reveal. This was the moment she'd been expecting and hoping for, the natural culmination of months of growing affection and partnership. "I want that too," she said simply. "I've wanted it for weeks now, but I was afraid to say so. Afraid you might think I was being presumptuous about our arrangement." "There's nothing presumptuous about a wife wanting to share her husband's bed," Thad said, reaching out to take her hand in his. "The presumption was mine, thinking I could keep you at arm's length when you've become the most important thing in my life." They moved toward each other slowly, like people approaching something precious that might break if handled carelessly. When Thad cupped Martha's face in his calloused hands and kissed her gently, it felt like coming home after a long journey through hostile country. When Martha's arms went around his neck and she kissed him back with equal tenderness, 15 years of loneliness melted away like snow under spring sunshine. Their first night together, as husband and wife in truth, as well as name, was tender rather than passionate, marked by the careful consideration of two people who'd learned that the best things in life were worth taking time to savor. They made love with the profound gratitude of people who'd given up hope of ever again experiencing such intimate connection, and afterward lay talking softly until dawn painted the eastern windows with light. When morning came, they woke in each other's arms for the first time, and both understood that their practical arrangement had become something neither had dared hope for when they'd spoken their careful vows in the Cedar Falls church. They'd found not just survival partnership, but love, the mature, tested kind of love that grows from friendship and respect and shared struggle rather than youthful passion that burns bright and fast. As they prepared breakfast together in the quiet cabin, moving around each other with the ease of long practice, but now with added touches and small intimacies that spoke of their changed relationship, both Martha and Thad felt a contentment neither had experienced in years. Winter still gripped the mountains outside their windows, but inside their sanctuary, spring had arrived early in the form of love that had taken root slowly and was strong enough to weather whatever storms the future might bring. Spring came early to the high country that year, with March bringing warm Chinook winds that began eating away at the massive snowdrifts that had defined their world for 4 months. Martha and Thad spent their days opening shutters to let fresh air and sunlight flood their cabin, checking on the livestock that had wintered successfully in the protected barn, and planning improvements they wanted to make during the coming months of good weather. Their marriage had settled into a rhythm of easy intimacy and shared purpose that made both of them marvel at how completely their lives had been transformed. The separate quarters originally planned were now used for storage and Martha's sewing projects, while they shared the cabin's main bedroom with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd discovered they were perfectly suited to each other's sleeping habits and morning routines. Thad had begun preliminary work on the horse breeding operation they'd discussed during the winter, clearing additional pasture and planning fence lines that would divide his property into manageable sections. Martha had started writing again, filling pages with observations about frontier life and the unique challenges faced by women on the isolated homesteads scattered throughout mountain country. Her articles were taking shape as something that might indeed interest Eastern magazines, hungry for authentic accounts of Western life. It was during one of these productive, optimistic days in mid-March that their peaceful existence was shattered by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Martha was hanging laundry on the line Thad had strung between 2 pine trees when she noticed a rider picking his way carefully up the muddy trail that led to their cabin. Her first reaction was pleasure. Winter visitors were rare, and she'd grown to appreciate the occasional contact with the outside world that helped break the monotony of isolation. But as the rider drew closer, something about his appearance made her uneasy. He was a large man, well dressed in the style of someone from back east, rather than the practical clothing favored by mountain dwellers. His horse was a fine animal, but showed signs of hard traveling, and there was something in the man's posture, alert, predatory, purposeful, that suggested he wasn't simply a lost traveler seeking directions. Thad emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness leather, his expression growing guarded as he studied their approaching visitor. 15 years of mountain living had honed his instincts for reading people, and everything about this stranger suggested trouble of one kind or another. "Good afternoon," the man called out as he drew rein near their cabin, his voice carrying the flat accent of the Illinois prairie. "Would you be Thaddeus Crowe?" "I would," Thad replied carefully, positioning himself between the stranger and Martha without appearing to do so deliberately. "What can I do for you?" The man dismounted with the fluid movements of someone comfortable in the saddle, but his attention was focused on Martha rather than Thad. "Actually, it's Mrs. Crowe I'm here to see, though I suppose she's been going by that name for some time now." Martha felt ice form in her stomach, despite the warm spring air. There was something in the man's tone, familiar, proprietary, threatening, that made her want to retreat into the cabin and bar the door. Instead, she forced herself to walk over and stand beside Thad, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm Martha Crowe," she said, lifting her chin in the gesture that had become her signature response to challenging situations. "What is your business with me?" The stranger smiled, but it was the kind of expression that wolves might wear when cornering prey. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Henry Caldwell, and I represent certain business interests back in Illinois that have been very interested in locating you." "Mrs. Quinn, excuse me, Mrs. Crowe." The name meant nothing to Martha, but the way he emphasized her former surname sent alarm bells ringing through her mind. "I'm afraid I don't understand what business you could have with me." "Mr. Caldwell." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly," Caldwell replied, reaching into his saddlebags and withdrawing a leather portfolio. "You see, your late husband's debts didn't die with him, as you apparently hoped they would. The gentlemen he borrowed money from have been very patient, but patience has its limits." Martha's face went pale as Caldwell extracted a sheaf of legal documents from the portfolio and held them where she could see the official seals and signatures. "These papers make very interesting reading. Mrs. Crowe. Promissory notes signed by James Quinn for substantial sums, all guaranteed by his personal property and that of his wife." "That's impossible," Martha said, though her voice lacked conviction. "James never told you about his gambling debts?" Caldwell interrupted. "Never mentioned the money he borrowed to cover his losses at poker games in Springfield? Never explained why he was working such long hours in the months before his death?" Each question hit Martha like a physical blow, bringing back memories she'd tried to forget. James's unexplained absences, his nervous behavior in the months before his heart attack, the way he'd avoided talking about their finances, even when she'd tried to discuss their retirement plans. Thad stepped forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down dangerous situations before. "What exactly are you claiming these papers prove, Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm not claiming anything," Caldwell replied smoothly. "I'm stating facts. James Quinn owed my clients $15,000 when he died. His widow inherited those debts, along with whatever assets he left behind. Since the fire conveniently destroyed any property that might have been liquidated to satisfy the debt, my clients have been forced to look for alternative means of collection." "Such as?" Thad asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer, Caldwell gestured toward the cabin and surrounding property with proprietary satisfaction. "Such as the assets Mrs. Crowe has acquired through her recent marriage. This property, for instance, would go a long way towards satisfying what's owed. You're threatening to take my land." Thad's voice remained level, but Martha could see the dangerous stillness that came over him. When he felt truly threatened, the same predatory alertness she'd observed in wild animals when they prepared to fight for their territory. "I'm not threatening anything," Caldwell said. "I'm simply explaining the legal realities. Mrs. Crowe's debts are now her husband's responsibility under the law. If those debts can't be satisfied through cash payment, then other assets must be considered." Martha felt the world tilting around her as the implications of Caldwell's words sank in. The peaceful life she and Thad had built together, the home they'd created from practical beginnings and nurtured into something precious, all of it was threatened by debts she'd never known existed. Obligations that her dead husband had concealed from her during their entire marriage. "How do we know these documents are legitimate?" Thad asked, though Martha could hear in his voice that he believed they probably were. Men like Caldwell didn't travel hundreds of miles into mountain country without being certain of their legal ground. "You're welcome to have them examined by any attorney you choose," Caldwell replied. "Though I should mention that my clients have grown weary of waiting for satisfaction. They've given me authority to settle this matter one way or another before I return to Illinois. The threat implicit in his words hung in the spring air like smoke from a green fire, acrid, choking, impossible to ignore. Martha understood that they were being given a choice between voluntary compliance and something much more unpleasant. "What are you proposing?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. $15,000 cash within 30 days, Caldwell said. "Or we'll be forced to initiate legal proceedings to seize this property and anything else that might satisfy the debt." Of course, legal proceedings can be expensive and time-consuming. It might be simpler for everyone if Mrs. Crowe simply returned to Illinois with me to work off what she owes in a more direct fashion. The last part of his proposal was delivered with a leer that made his meaning unmistakably clear. Martha felt sick at the thought of what working off her debt might involve, while Thad's hand moved instinctively toward the knife he wore at his belt. "That's not going to happen," Thad said quietly, but with such conviction that even Caldwell seemed to take notice. "Perhaps not," Caldwell agreed. "But then we're back to the question of how $15,000 is going to be raised in 30 days. From what I've observed, this is a fine property, but hardly the kind of operation that generates that level of cash flow." Martha's mind raced through possibilities and found none that offered hope. $15,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Certainly more than a mountain homestead could produce, even if they sold everything Thad owned. The debt was impossible to satisfy through legitimate means, which meant Caldwell and his clients knew they were essentially stealing Thad's property while maintaining a veneer of legal justification. "I need time to think," Martha said finally. "This is a shock. I had no idea James had borrowed such sums." "Of course you didn't," Caldwell said with mock sympathy. "Men often try to protect their wives from unpleasant financial realities. Unfortunately, ignorance doesn't absolve one of legal obligations." He mounted his horse with the same fluid grace he'd shown in dismounting, but there was no mistaking the threat in his demeanor. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Cedar Falls for the next few days, giving you time to consider your options. But don't take too long, Mrs. Crowe. My client's patience isn't unlimited, and there are other ways to collect debts when legal methods prove insufficient." As Caldwell rode away, his horse's hooves making sucking sounds in the muddy trail, Martha and Thad stood in stunned silence. The spring day that had begun with such promise now felt contaminated by the stranger's presence and the terrible choices his visit had forced upon them. "Martha," Thad said finally, reaching out to touch her arm, "whatever this is, whatever it costs, we'll figure it out together." But Martha was already shaking her head, tears streaming down her face as the full implications of their situation became clear. "No, Thaddeus. This is my burden, not yours. I won't let my dead husband's mistakes destroy what you've built here. What are you saying?" Martha wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, calling upon reserves of strength she'd hoped never to need again. "I'm saying that maybe I should go with him. Maybe that's the only way to protect you and everything you've worked for." "Like hell," Thad said with such vehemence that Martha actually stepped back. "You're my wife, Martha. What threatens you threatens me. We face this together or not at all." But even as he spoke the words, both of them understood the enormity of what they were up against. $15,000 might as well have been $15 million for all the hope they had of raising such a sum in 30 days. And if Caldwell's clients were the kind of men who collected gambling debts through violence and intimidation, then legal niceties might prove irrelevant. In any case, as they walked back toward their cabin, their sanctuary that no longer felt quite so secure, Martha carried the weight of knowing that her past had reached out to destroy the future she and Thad had been building together. The practical arrangement that had become precious love was now threatened by forces neither of them had anticipated, and the choices ahead offered nothing but pain and loss, regardless of what they decided. The legal document that Caldwell had shown them lay like a coiled snake in Martha's memory, ready to strike at everything they'd built together. Her charred Bible might have survived the fire that destroyed her first life, But it remained to be seen whether the love she'd found with Thaddeus Crowe could survive the legal and criminal forces that were determined to tear them apart. The night after Caldwell's visit passed in restless conversation and desperate planning as Martha and Thad struggled to find some solution to the impossible situation that had been thrust upon them. They examined the problem from every angle, legal, financial, and practical, but each path led to the same devastating conclusion. There was no legitimate way to raise $15,000 in 30 days, and any illegitimate methods would destroy them more surely than Caldwell's threats. Thad's first instinct was to fight, drawing on the tactical skills that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. He studied their cabin's defensible positions, calculated fields of fire, and mentally inventoried the weapons and ammunition at their disposal. But Martha quickly made him understand that violence would only make their situation worse. If something happens to Caldwell, others will come looking, she pointed out, with the practical wisdom that had made her such an effective teacher. His clients didn't send one man to collect $15,000 without expecting him to report back. If he disappears, they'll assume we killed him and send more men, probably men who won't bother with legal documents. The truth of her observation forced Thad to abandon his warrior's approach to the problem and search for subtler solutions. But 15 years of mountain solitude had not prepared him for the kind of complex negotiations that might resolve their crisis without bloodshed. It was Martha who suggested they ride to Cedar Falls the next morning to consult with Pastor Hartwell and perhaps find an attorney who could examine Caldwell's documents for legal weaknesses. The idea of fighting their battle in courtrooms rather than with rifles appealed to neither of them, but it seemed like their only hope of finding a solution that didn't involve losing everything they'd built together. The trip to town revealed that Caldwell had not been idle during his first day in Cedar Falls. He'd taken a room at the small hotel and immediately set about gathering information about Thaddeus Crowe's property and assets. Samuel Morrison reported that the stranger had asked detailed questions about Thad's trading relationships, the value of his livestock, and the legal status of his land claims. Seemed mighty interested in whether you had any debts of your own, Morrison told them with obvious concern. I didn't tell him anything specific, but he struck me as the kind of man who knows how to add 2 and 2 without needing help with the arithmetic. Pastor Hartwell received them in his study with the grave attention of a man who understood that their visit involved more than social courtesy. After listening to their account of Caldwell's threats and examining the copies of legal documents that Martha had insisted on reviewing before their visitor departed, the pastor's expression grew increasingly troubled. I'm afraid these appear to be legitimate, he said finally, setting aside the papers with obvious reluctance. The signatures look authentic, the seals are proper, and the legal language follows standard forms for promissory notes. More importantly, Mr. Caldwell is correct about the law regarding marital debt obligations. So we have no legal recourse? Thad asked, though his tone suggested he'd already accepted that answer. I didn't say that, Pastor Hartwell replied carefully. But any legal challenge would take months or years to resolve, and you'd need to post bond to prevent seizure of your property during the proceedings. The bond alone would probably exceed what you could raise. Martha sank deeper into her chair as the pastor's words confirmed her worst fears. The trap that James's hidden gambling had created was perfectly designed, large enough to be impossible to satisfy quickly, but legal enough to be enforced through official channels. Even if they could prove some irregularity in the documents, the process would bankrupt them long before they achieved victory. There is one other possibility, Pastor Hartwell said hesitantly, though it's not something I would normally suggest. What possibility? Martha asked, grasping at any hope, however slender. The railroad has been surveying through this area for a possible branch line to serve the mining operations up in Copper Creek. If that survey proves favorable, your property could become extremely valuable as a depot site. But that's months away from any concrete decision. And even then, the railroad's offers might not approach what you'd need. Thad was quiet for a moment, processing this information and what it might mean for their situation. You're suggesting we try to stall Caldwell until the railroad makes its decision? I'm suggesting it's the only legal option that might eventually provide enough money to satisfy these debts, Pastor Hartwell replied. But I'll be honest, it's a long shot that depends on many factors beyond your control. As they left the pastor's study, both Martha and Thad understood that their options had been reduced to desperate gambles or unacceptable sacrifices. The railroad possibility offered hope, but hope contingent on decisions made by distant executives who had no knowledge of their personal crisis. Their next stop was the hotel where Caldwell was staying, an uncomfortable confrontation that both dreaded but recognized as necessary. They found him in the dining room, enjoying a meal that probably cost more than most Cedar Falls residents spent on food in a week. His expensive clothes and confident demeanor stood out starkly against the simple surroundings, marking him as clearly foreign to the mountain community that had become their home. Mr. and Mrs. Crowe, he greeted them with false warmth, gesturing to empty chairs at his table. Please join me. I was hoping we'd have a chance to discuss your decision. We need more time, Martha said without preamble, refusing his invitation to sit. 30 days isn't sufficient to arrange the kind of financial settlement you're demanding. Caldwell's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm afraid my clients have been more than patient already. Mrs. Crowe, your husband died over 2 years ago, and you've made no effort to contact them about satisfaction of his debts. Because I didn't know the debts existed, Martha replied, her voice carrying the steel that had once commanded unruly classrooms. If James had told me about his gambling, but he didn't, Caldwell interrupted smoothly. And ignorance, as I mentioned yesterday, doesn't absolve legal obligations. However, I'm a reasonable man. I might be able to extend the deadline to 60 days if you can provide some assurance of good faith. What kind of assurance? Thad asked, though his tone suggested he expected to dislike the answer. A down payment, perhaps. Something to demonstrate that you're taking this matter seriously. Say $1,000 by the end of this week. The amount hit them like a physical blow. $1,000 was more cash than Thad typically saw in 6 months of trading, far beyond what they could possibly raise in a matter of days. Caldwell's suggestion was clearly designed to demonstrate the impossibility of their situation, rather than offer genuine compromise. We don't have that kind of money readily available, Thad said carefully. Our assets are tied up in property and livestock. Then perhaps it's time to consider liquidation, Caldwell replied, his false sympathy unable to mask the predatory satisfaction in his voice. I'm sure you could find buyers for some of your holdings. The local ranchers might be interested in your horses, for instance. The suggestion that they start dismantling their life piece by piece sent rage coursing through Thad's veins, but years of self-discipline kept his expression neutral. He understood that Caldwell was baiting them, trying to provoke a response that would justify more extreme measures. We'll consider our options, Martha said with dignity that impressed even their tormentor. But we won't be bullied into hasty decisions that would destroy our livelihood. Of course not, Caldwell agreed. Take all the time you need within reason. But remember, Mrs. Crowe, my clients have investments in this matter that go beyond simple debt collection. They have reputations to maintain, and those reputations depend on people understanding that obligations to them are always satisfied. One way or another, the threat was delivered with such casual menace that both Martha and Thad felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. They were dealing with more than legal debt collectors. They were facing criminals who used the law as a weapon when convenient and abandoned it when other methods proved more effective. As they left the hotel, Martha's composure finally cracked. She had maintained perfect control during the confrontation, but once they were outside in the crisp mountain air, tears began streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Thaddius, she sobbed, leaning against him for support. I've brought this disaster into your life, and there's no way to fix it. Everything you've worked for, everything we've built together, I'm going to lose it all because of James's lies and gambling. Thad held her close, feeling her body shake with the force of emotions she'd been suppressing since Caldwell's arrival. None of this is your fault, Martha. Your husband made choices that he kept hidden from you. You can't be blamed for consequences you never knew existed. But I should have known, Martha insisted. I was married to him for 37 years. How could I not see that he was living a secret life, borrowing money for gambling debts? Because he was protecting you from knowledge that would have caused you pain, Thad replied, though his own anger at James Quinn was considerable. Men sometimes think they're being noble when they're actually being foolish. They returned to their cabin in heavy silence, each lost in thoughts about the impossible choices that lay ahead. The home that had seemed so secure and peaceful just days before now felt like a temporary shelter that could be swept away at any moment. Every comfortable familiarity, the quilts Martha had arranged on their bed, the carved gifts Thad had made for her, the books they'd read together by firelight, now seemed precious and fragile. That evening, as they sat before their fire, trying to find comfort in familiar routines, Thad made a decision that surprised even himself. "Martha," he said, setting aside the harness he'd been pretending to mend, "I want to tell you about something I've never mentioned to anyone in Cedar Falls." She looked up from her sewing, recognizing the serious tone that meant he was about to share something significant. "What is it?" "I have money," Thad said simply, "more than anyone knows about. I've been saving every penny from my trapping and trading for 15 years, storing it in a cache up in the mountains where no one would think to look." Martha's needle stopped moving as the implications of his revelation sank in. "How much money?" "Enough to pay Caldwell and his clients," Thad replied. "Enough to end this threat and give us back our peace." "Oh, Thaddius," Martha breathed, hope and despair warring in her voice. "You can't possibly give up 15 years of savings for debts that aren't even yours." "They became mine when I married you," Thad said firmly. "That's what marriage means, taking on each other's burdens as well as sharing each other's joys." Martha set down her sewing and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "But it's everything you've worked for, everything you've saved. It was probably meant for your old age, for security, when you can't trap and hunt anymore. What good is security if I lose you to get it?" Thad asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Or what's the point of having money in the bank if the woman I love is forced to leave me because of circumstances beyond her control?" "But $15,000 is just money," Thad interrupted. "You are irreplaceable. Our life together is irreplaceable. I won't let James Quinn's gambling debts destroy what we've built. Not when I have the means to prevent it." Martha began crying again. But these were tears of relief mixed with overwhelming gratitude and love. "Are you certain? Once we pay them, there's no getting that money back. We'll be starting over with nothing but this cabin and the land. We'll be starting over with each other," Thad corrected. "And that's more than either of us thought we'd have when we first shook hands in Pastor Hartwell's church." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. How to retrieve the hidden cash without arousing suspicion. How to present the payment to Caldwell in a way that ensured he would honor his agreement and disappear from their lives permanently. How to protect themselves if his clients decided that successful collection of one debt made them attractive targets for future extortion. "We'll need witnesses when we make the payment," Martha observed with the practical wisdom that had served her well through years of managing difficult situations. "Pastor Hartwell, Samuel Morrison, maybe the sheriff from the county seat. People who can testify that we satisfied the debt in full." "Good thinking," Thad agreed. "And we'll insist on written receipts, documentation that proves we've met all legal obligations." As they refined their strategy, both felt the weight of crisis beginning to lift from their shoulders. The solution wasn't ideal. Losing 15 years of savings would set back their plans for expansion and security, but it offered something more valuable than money: the chance to preserve the life they'd built together. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with spring sunshine highlighting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded their valley. As they prepared for the journey to Thad's hidden cache, Martha watched her husband moving with the determined efficiency that characterized him when he'd committed to a course of action. There was something magnificent about his willingness to sacrifice everything material he'd accumulated in order to protect what they'd created. Together, "Thaddeus," she said as they saddled their horses for the trip into the high country, "I want you to know that whatever happens, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You saved me from despair and gave me hope when I thought I was finished with both." Thad paused in tightening his horse's cinch and turned to face her fully. "Martha, you saved my life too, in ways that go far beyond pulling me out of that snowdrift. You reminded me what it means to have something worth fighting for." They kissed then, standing in the morning sunlight beside their cabin, and both understood that they were about to face the greatest test their marriage had yet encountered. Whether they emerged stronger or were broken by the pressure remained to be seen, but they would face it together, as partners in the truest sense of the word. The trail to Thad's cache led high into country that few people ever saw. Remote enough that discovery was unlikely, but accessible enough that he could reach it when necessity demanded. As they rode upward through increasingly spectacular scenery, Martha marveled at the fact that her husband had been carrying this secret for their entire marriage, not from any desire to deceive her, but from the mountain man's instinctive caution about revealing assets that might attract unwanted attention. "How did you choose the hiding place?" she asked during one of their rest stops. "Same way I chose everything else up here," Thad replied, scanning the surrounding peaks with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd learned to read the mountains like a book. "It had to be secure, hidden, but also accessible when I needed it. Somewhere that wouldn't be disturbed by weather, or animals or casual travelers." When they finally reached the cache, a carefully constructed hiding place built into a natural cave and sealed with rocks that appeared to have fallen there naturally, Martha watched in amazement as Thad revealed the full extent of his financial preparations. The money was stored in waterproof containers, organized by denomination, and accompanied by detailed records of every deposit and withdrawal. $15,847, Thad announced after they'd counted the currency twice to be certain of the amount. More than enough to satisfy Caldwell and still have something left for expenses. As they carefully repackaged the money for transport back to their cabin, Martha felt the familiar mixture of relief and regret that accompanied all of life's major sacrifices. They were about to purchase their freedom and security, but at a cost that represented decades of careful saving and planning for the future. "No regrets?" she asked, as they prepared to leave the cache site. "None," Thad replied with the conviction of a man who'd examined his priorities and found them clearly ordered. "Money can be earned again. What we have together is irreplaceable." The ride back to their cabin passed quickly, both of them eager to conclude the business with Caldwell and begin rebuilding their life on a foundation cleared of the threats that had shadowed their happiness. By evening, they would either be free of James Quinn's legacy of debt and deception, or they would discover that their problems went deeper than mere money could solve. But as they descended toward their valley with its familiar landmarks and the cabin that had become their sanctuary, both Martha and Thad felt the quiet confidence that comes from knowing they'd chosen love over security, partnership over individual survival. Whatever the outcome of their confrontation with Caldwell, they would face it as they'd learned to face everything else, together, with honesty and mutual support that had transformed a practical arrangement into something approaching sacred. The confrontation with Caldwell was arranged for the following afternoon at Pastor Hartwell's church, neutral ground that would provide witnesses and discourage any attempt at violence or intimidation. Martha and Thad arrived early, carrying the money in a leather satchel that represented 15 years of careful saving and the sacrifice of dreams they'd planned to pursue together. Pastor Hartwell had invited Samuel Morrison and his wife to serve as additional witnesses, while also sending word to the county sheriff that his presence might be required for a significant financial transaction. The precautions were designed to ensure that Caldwell couldn't later claim the debt hadn't been satisfied or attempt to extort additional payments. When Caldwell arrived precisely at the appointed time, his confident demeanor suggested he expected either to collect a token payment or to begin the process of seizing Thad's property. The sight of the leather satchel sitting on the church's altar table clearly surprised him, though he recovered quickly and resumed his predatory smile. "I trust you've given careful consideration to my client's position," he said, removing his hat and settling into one of the wooden pews as though he owned the building. "Have you perhaps found some assets that could be liquidated to demonstrate good faith?" "We've found something better than good faith," Thad replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd made peace with his decision. "We found the full amount your clients claim they're owed." Caldwell's expression shifted rapidly through surprise, suspicion, and calculating greed. "The full amount? $15,000? $15,000, Martha confirmed, opening the satchel to reveal neat stacks of currency organized by denomination. "Legal tender of the United States, as your documents specify." For the first time since his arrival in Cedar Falls, Caldwell appeared genuinely taken aback. He'd clearly expected to play a longer game of intimidation and incremental collection, not to be confronted with immediate payment in full. The sight of so much cash in a remote mountain settlement seemed to violate his assumptions about frontier poverty and limited resources. "I must say, this is unexpected," he admitted, leaning forward to examine the money more closely. "May I ask where mountain farmers acquire such substantial funds?" "Our financial arrangements are private," Pastor Hartwell interjected firmly. "The only relevant question is whether this payment satisfies the obligations described in your documents." Caldwell spent the next hour carefully counting the money while the witnesses observed his every movement. Martha and Thad watched in tense silence as 15 years of Thad's savings were transferred stack by stack into Caldwell's possession. Each bill representing days of hard work in dangerous country, pelts carried down treacherous mountain trails, careful decisions to save rather than spend. When the counting was complete, Caldwell sat back with an expression that mixed satisfaction with obvious reluctance. He'd succeeded in collecting the debt, but the ease of payment suggested he'd underestimated the resources available to his targets. Martha suspected he was already calculating whether additional claims might be manufactured to extract more money. "The amount is correct," he announced finally. $15,000, which satisfies the principal debt owed by James Quinn. However, there remains the matter of interest and collection costs. "The documents you showed us specified the principal amount only," Pastor Hartwell interrupted, consulting the copies Martha had insisted on retaining. "There's no mention of additional charges beyond the $15,000. Caldwell's jaw tightened at having his attempted modification challenged so quickly. "Standard practice includes reasonable collection expenses. Nothing about your collection methods has been standard or reasonable," Thad said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made Caldwell pause in his objections. "You came here threatening my wife and my property." "You'll take what's owed according to your own documents and be satisfied with it." The threat implicit in Thad's tone wasn't lost on anyone present. For all his bluster and legal documentation, Caldwell was a single man hundreds of miles from assistance, facing a community that had already demonstrated its willingness to support Martha and Thad against outside pressure. "Very well," Caldwell said after a moment's consideration. "The debt is satisfied in full. I'll prepare appropriate documentation releasing Mrs. Crowe from any further obligations related to her late husband's borrowing." Pastor Hartwell had anticipated this need and provided paper and ink for the necessary paperwork. Under the watchful eyes of multiple witnesses, Caldwell wrote out a detailed receipt acknowledging payment in full and releasing Martha from all claims related to James Quinn's debts. The document was signed, witnessed, and carefully preserved as proof that their ordeal was finally over. As Caldwell prepared to leave Cedar Falls with his collection, Martha felt a complex mixture of relief and loss that left her emotionally drained. The threat to their marriage and property had been eliminated, but at a cost that would affect their lives for years to come. Thad's life savings were gone, their plans for expansion and security postponed indefinitely. "I trust this concludes our business permanently," Pastor Hartwell said as Caldwell prepared to depart. "Mrs. Crowe has satisfied all legal obligations, and any future contact would constitute harassment." "Of course," Caldwell agreed smoothly, though his expression suggested he might have different thoughts about permanent conclusion. "My clients are businessmen who honor their agreements. Once a debt is satisfied, they consider the matter closed." But as he rode away from Cedar Falls with $15,000 in his saddlebags, Martha noticed him studying the town and surrounding countryside with the calculating gaze of someone memorizing details for future reference. She feared their troubles might not be over, despite the formal settlement of James's debts. That evening, alone in their cabin for the first time since Caldwell's arrival, Martha and Thad sat before their fire and contemplated what they'd accomplished and what they'd lost. The familiar space felt different somehow. Still their home, but now carrying the weight of sacrifice that changed its meaning. "Do you regret it?" Martha asked, watching flames dance in the fireplace Thad had built with his own hands. "Giving up everything you'd saved for my husband's debts?" Thad was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of pine with the carved knife that had become his signature tool for expressing affection. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that James Quinn put gambling ahead of his family's security. But I don't regret paying the money to keep you safe." Martha moved to sit beside him on the simple wooden bench they'd shared for so many evenings. "We'll have to start over completely. No savings, no security beyond what this cabin and land can provide. We started with nothing but a practical arrangement," Thad reminded her, his hands continuing their steady work on the small wooden carving. "Seems to me we've proven we can build something worthwhile from nothing at all." As he spoke, he handed her the piece he'd been carving, a simple ring fashioned from mountain oak, smooth and perfectly sized for her finger. It was clearly meant to replace the wedding band from her first marriage, a symbol of new commitment forged from local materials rather than purchased metal. "This represents us," Thad said as Martha examined the wooden ring with tears in her eyes. "Made from what we found here, shaped by our own hands, simple but strong enough to last." Martha slipped the oak ring onto her finger, removing James's gold band and setting it aside without ceremony. The wooden ring felt different, lighter but somehow more substantial, a reminder of love freely chosen rather than obligations inherited from the past. "I love you, Thaddeus Crowe," she said, the words carrying weight earned through months of partnership and tested by crisis. "I love you for your strength, your generosity, your willingness to sacrifice everything for our life together. I love you too." "Martha," Thad replied, setting aside his carving tools and taking her hands in his. "More than I thought I'd ever love anyone again, more than I thought I was capable of loving." They made love that night, with the passion of people who'd nearly lost each other, celebrating not just physical union, but the deeper bond that had carried them through their greatest test. When morning came, they would begin the work of rebuilding their financial security from nothing. But they would do it together, as partners who'd proven their commitment beyond any doubt. As Martha drifted towards sleep in Thad's arms, she thought about the pressed wildflower in her charred Bible, something beautiful that had survived when everything else was destroyed. Their love had proven equally resilient, blooming again after trauma that might have destroyed it entirely. The threats that had shadowed their happiness were gone, paid for with money that could be earned again, given time and effort. What couldn't be replaced? Trust, partnership, the rare gift of finding someone who chose to build a life with you rather than simply share space. These precious things remained intact, stronger for having been tested and proven genuine. Outside their cabin, Spring continued its gradual transformation of the mountain landscape. Snow melting to reveal the green promise of another growing season. Inside, two people who'd found each other through practical necessity slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they'd learned to face everything else, together, with love that had grown strong enough to survive anything life might demand of it. 2 weeks after Caldwell's departure, Martha and Thad had begun to believe their ordeal was truly over. They'd resumed their normal routines. Thad checking his trap lines and planning improvements to their property. Martha writing articles about frontier life and managing their household with renewed appreciation for its simple comforts. The tension that had marked their interactions during the debt crisis had faded, replaced by a deeper intimacy born of shared trials and mutual sacrifice. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that disaster struck again, this time in a form that threatened everything they'd fought to preserve. Martha was hanging laundry in the warm April sunshine when she noticed smoke rising from the direction of Cedar Falls, not the normal cooking fires or chimney smoke that marked daily life, but the thick, black columns that spoke of serious conflagration. Thad emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness leather, his expression growing grave as he studied the ominous signs on the horizon. After 15 years in mountain country, he could read smoke like a language, and what he saw suggested catastrophe on a scale that small communities rarely survived. Could be the hotel, he said, squinting against the bright sunlight. Or Morrison's store. That much smoke means a big building, probably with supplies that'll feed the fire for hours. They saddled their horses quickly and rode toward town, joining other residents from outlying homesteads who'd seen the smoke and come to help fight the fire or assist with evacuation. The trail down from their cabin gave them an elevated view of Cedar Falls, and what they saw made Martha's heart sink with dread. The fire hadn't started at the hotel or store. It had begun at Pastor Hartwell's church, the building where they'd married and later confronted Caldwell with payment of James's debts. The wooden structure was completely engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers, while smaller blazes spread to nearby buildings, despite the frantic efforts of volunteer firefighters. But it was the sight of Pastor Hartwell's body lying motionless in the churchyard that transformed their concern into horror. Even from a distance, they could see that his death hadn't been caused by smoke inhalation or accident. The unnatural angle of his limbs and the dark stain spreading beneath his head spoke of violence that had preceded the fire. "Dear God," Martha whispered, her hands trembling as she fought to control her horse's nervousness around the smoke and confusion. Who would do such a thing? Pastor Hartwell never hurt anyone in his life. Thad's expression had gone cold and hard, the same predatory alertness Martha had observed when Caldwell first threatened their peace. His military training was asserting itself, reading the scene with tactical eyes that looked for patterns and threats rather than focusing on emotional responses to tragedy. "This wasn't random," he said quietly, scanning the crowd of firefighters and townspeople for faces that didn't belong. Someone wanted the pastor dead and the church destroyed. The question is whether this has anything to do with our business with Caldwell. The answer to that question came from Samuel Morrison, who rode up to them with his face blackened by smoke and his expression carrying the grim satisfaction of someone who discovered important information under terrible circumstances. "Thank God you're both safe," he said without preamble. "We found evidence in the church before the roof collapsed, papers scattered around Pastor Hartwell's body, documents that looked like copies of those debt papers you showed him." Martha felt ice form in her stomach, despite the warm spring air. "You think someone was looking for the records of our payment to Caldwell?" "I think someone wanted to eliminate the witnesses to that payment," Morrison replied grimly. "Pastor Hartwell was killed before the fire started, struck in the head with something heavy. Whoever did it took time to search his office before setting the blaze." Thad's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, his eyes continuing to scan their surroundings for potential threats. If they killed the pastor to destroy evidence of our settlement, they might come after us next. We were the principals in that transaction. "There's more," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private despite the chaos around them. "Mrs. Morrison was at the hotel this morning when word of the fire spread. The desk clerk mentioned that a stranger had been asking questions yesterday, man matching Caldwell's description, wanting to know who'd witnessed his business at the church. The implications hit all three of them simultaneously. Caldwell hadn't departed permanently after collecting the money. He'd returned, possibly with associates, to eliminate evidence that the debt had been satisfied. If they could destroy proof of payment and silence the witnesses, they could attempt to collect the $15,000 again, or make new claims based on manufactured documents. "We need to get you both somewhere safe," Morrison said urgently. "If they're eliminating witnesses, you're the biggest threats to whatever scheme they're running." But even as he spoke, Martha noticed riders approaching the outskirts of town. Not locals coming to help with the fire, but strangers whose purposeful movement suggested hostile intentions. She counted at least 4 men, all well-armed and displaying the confident bearing of people accustomed to intimidating others through violence. "Thaddeus," she said quietly, touching his arm to draw his attention to the approaching threat. "I think it's too late to run." Thad followed her gaze and immediately understood the tactical situation they faced. The strangers had positioned themselves to control the main trails leading out of Cedar Falls, effectively trapping anyone who might try to flee. Their timing suggested careful planning, arriving during the confusion of the fire when normal defenses would be disrupted and attention focused elsewhere. "Morrison," Thad said, with the calm authority of someone who'd faced similar situations during the war, "I need you to spread word quietly among the men. We're about to be attacked by criminals who killed Pastor Hartwell. Anyone who can handle a weapon needs to be ready to defend the town." "What about the women and children?" Morrison asked, already understanding the seriousness of their situation. "Get them to the store. It's the most defensible building we have. Stone walls, limited access points, supplies that could sustain a siege if necessary." Thad was thinking tactically now, drawing on hard-earned experience with asymmetric warfare and desperate defenses. As Morrison rode off to organize the town's defenses, Martha and Thad found themselves facing the same impossible choice that had driven them to pay Caldwell's extortion in the first place. They could surrender and hope that cooperation would satisfy their attackers, or they could fight against overwhelming odds with no guarantee of success. "I won't let them take you," Thad said simply, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Whatever they want, whatever they're planning, it ends here." Martha felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had sustained her through previous crises. "Then we fight together," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I didn't survive losing everything once, just to let criminals destroy what we've rebuilt." The approaching riders had closed to within rifle range. Their leader, a man who bore enough resemblance to Caldwell to suggest family relationship, raising his hand in a gesture that was clearly meant as signal rather than greeting. In that moment, Martha and Thad understood that their payment of James's debt had been only the beginning of an extortion scheme that would continue until they were completely destroyed or their tormentors were stopped permanently as the first shots rang out across the smoke-filled valley. Martha reached for the rifle Thad had insisted she learn to use during their winter months together. The practical arrangement that had become precious love was about to face its ultimate test, with survival depending not just on their commitment to each other, but on their willingness to fight for the life they'd built in this remote mountain sanctuary. The battle for Cedar Falls, and for their right to live in peace, was about to begin. 1 year later, Martha and Thaddeus Crowe sat on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching the sun paint the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson that never failed to take their breath away. The seasons had turned full circle since the terrible events that had tested their marriage and their community's resolve. And the scars left by violence and loss were beginning to heal in the way that mountain country healed all wounds. Slowly, but with enduring strength, the battle for Cedar Falls had lasted 3 days, with Caldwell's criminal associates attempting to terrorize the community into submission through arson, theft, and intimidation. But they had underestimated both the resolve of mountain people protecting their homes and the tactical skills that Thaddeus Crowe brought to organizing their defense. The fight had been brutal and costly. 2 townspeople killed, several wounded, and significant property damage, but it had ended with the criminals either dead or fled, never to return. Caldwell himself had been captured alive during the final assault on Morrison's store, where the townspeople had made their determined stand. Under pressure from federal marshals, who'd finally arrived to investigate reports of organized criminal activity, he'd revealed the full scope of the debt collection scheme that had targeted Martha and dozens of other widows across the frontier territories. The operation had been designed to manufacture or inflate debts that could be collected through intimidation and violence, with legal documentation providing a veneer of legitimacy for what amounted to systematic theft. Martha's original debt from James's gambling had been real, but Caldwell and his associates had inflated it through fraudulent interest charges and collection fees, then planned to eliminate witnesses and collect multiple times from the same victims. The burning of Pastor Hartwell's church and the murder of the gentle minister had been part of a calculated plan to destroy evidence and intimidate anyone who might challenge their claims. The federal investigation had ultimately revealed a network of criminal activity spanning multiple states, with dozens of victims who'd been terrorized into paying debts they didn't owe or had already satisfied. Martha and Thad's resistance had helped break up an organization that had destroyed countless lives through its combination of legal manipulation and outright violence. But justice, however satisfying, couldn't restore what they'd lost during those terrible days. Pastor Hartwell's death had left a hole in the community that would never be completely filled, though a young minister named David Fletcher had come from Denver to serve the rebuilt church. The financial cost of defending Cedar Falls had exhausted the savings of most residents, including the small amount Martha and Thad had managed to accumulate since paying off the original debt. Yet as they sat together, watching another mountain sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, both felt a contentment that had less to do with material prosperity than with the deeper wealth they'd discovered in each other's company. Their cabin had been rebuilt larger than before, with separate rooms for the guests who occasionally visited, and a study where Martha could pursue her writing without interruption. The articles she'd begun during their first winter together had found audiences in Eastern magazines hungry for authentic accounts of frontier life, providing modest but steady income that supplemented Thad's trapping and trading. The horse breeding operation they'd planned had finally become reality, though on a smaller scale than originally envisioned. 6 mares and a stallion now grazed in the pasture behind their cabin, hardy mountain stock that commanded good prices from ranchers and miners who needed animals capable of handling rough country. The work was demanding but satisfying, requiring the kind of patient attention to detail that both Martha and Thad had learned to appreciate during their years together. More importantly, they discovered that their partnership could survive anything life might demand of it. The practical arrangement that had begun as mutual necessity had been tested by external threats, financial catastrophe and life-or-death violence, emerging stronger and more precious for having endured such trials. What they'd built together wasn't just a marriage, it was a fortress of mutual support that provided security no amount of money could purchase. "Mrs. Crowe," Thad said suddenly, using the formal address that had become an endearment between them. "Do you ever regret accepting my proposal that day in the church?" Martha looked up from the letter she'd been reading. Correspondence. from an editor in Boston who wanted to publish a collection of her frontier essays and smiled with the contentment of someone who'd found exactly where she belonged in the world. "Never," she said simply. "Not for one moment, even during the worst of our troubles. Do you regret offering it?" "Only that I waited so long to find the courage," Thad replied, reaching over to take her hand in his. The wooden ring he'd carved for her during their crisis had been replaced by a simple gold band, purchased with money from her writing. But she still wore the oak ring on her right hand, as a reminder of love proven under pressure. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over their valley and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. From inside the cabin came the warm glow of oil lamps and the promise of another quiet evening together, reading, talking, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company in the home they'd created with their own hands and hearts. A photograph sat on their mantelpiece now, the first formal portrait they'd commissioned during a trip to Denver the previous autumn. The image showed a distinguished couple in their middle years, Martha with her silver-streaked hair arranged elegantly but practically, Thad with his beard neatly trimmed and his eyes reflecting the peace that had replaced the haunted look of his solitary years. They stood close together, her hand resting on his shoulder, both wearing expressions of quiet satisfaction that spoke of lives well lived and challenges successfully. The photograph represented more than just a record of their appearance. It was evidence of the family they'd created from two lonely hearts, proof that second chances could lead to happiness that surpassed even the dreams of youth. Visitors who saw it invariably commented on the obvious affection between the couple, the sense of partnership that radiated from even a static image. "Do you think we'll grow old together successfully?" Martha asked as they prepared to go inside for the evening, a question that reflected not doubt but wonder at the gift they'd been given. "I think we've already grown old together successfully," Thad replied, standing and offering her his arm with the same courtesy he'd shown during their wedding ceremony 3 years earlier. "Everything from here on is just enjoying the rewards of good choices and hard work." As they walked into their cabin together, leaving the mountain night to its ancient rhythms of wind and starlight, both understood that they'd achieved something rare and precious, a love that didn't depend on youth or passion, but on deeper foundations of respect, partnership, and mutual commitment to building something worthy. Together, the practical arrangement that had saved two desperate people from loneliness, and one had become a marriage that enriched every aspect of their daily existence. They'd learned that the best kind of love wasn't the dramatic passion of storybooks, but the steady, reliable affection that grew stronger with each shared challenge and each quiet evening spent in grateful companionship. Outside their windows, the mountain wilderness continued its eternal cycles of season and weather, beautiful and dangerous and utterly indifferent to human concerns. But inside their sanctuary, two people who'd thought themselves finished with love's possibilities had discovered that the heart's capacity for renewal was as endless as the peaks that surrounded their chosen home. They'd found each other when hope seemed lost, built something beautiful from the most practical beginnings, and proven that it's never too late to choose love over safety, partnership over solitude, and the courage to trust again over the easy cynicism that protects but never truly satisfies. As they settled into their evening routines, Martha at her writing desk working on another article, Thad by the fire with a book and his carving tools, both carried the quiet satisfaction of people who discovered life's most important secret. That genuine happiness comes not from having everything you want, but from deeply appreciating what you've been given, and from choosing each day to build something worthy with the person who's chosen to build it alongside you. The mountain wind sighed through the pine boughs outside their cabin, carrying the promise of another winter to test their preparations and another spring to reward their endurance. But inside their circle of lamplight and love, Martha and Thaddeus Crowe had already found everything they needed to face whatever seasons might come, each other, the strength that grows from shared struggle, and the profound peace that comes from knowing you found the one person in all the world who understands that the best marriages aren't built on grand gestures, but on the daily choice to be kind, honest, and committed to something larger than individual comfort. They had needed a practical arrangement, but they had found a love story worth telling, the kind of mature, tested romance that proves love's greatest triumphs often come to those patient enough to let it grow slowly and wise enough to tend it carefully.